Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, Parallel Deku, back with another fanfiction. This is the series of What If Deku Became the Shadow Villain? Now before starting, please give this video a like. And subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Who, more than a century ago, would have thought that heroes and villains would exist? That was the reality now. The sixth generation of quirks was being born while I belonged to the fifth. I was young 16, but this is not my story yet. Quirks had appeared more than 100 years ago, and now 8 out of every 10 people had one. They changed the world. Those new humans were seen as the next step in evolution, and with them came a profession that once belonged only to fiction, heroes. On the other side were the villains, people who believed they had the right to impose their will. Because of heroes, every child wanted to become one. Being a hero meant admiration, good pay, fame, and attention. Over time, the profession had become corrupt in some parts, and I knew that already at my age. I was a villain not by choice, but because it was the only way I could survive. But to understand who I had become, the context mattered. Every story has a background. 10 years earlier, in Shizuoka, a small green-haired boy of about 5 slept under the shade of a tree. He wore torn clothes and bore bruises and burns across his skin. The boy's quirk was dark and had upended his life. A year earlier, everything had been different. He had no father but a mother who outwardly showed affection. At first, that was how everyone thought it was. When they learned of his quirk, however, something in her changed. She did not become openly violent, but the boy could feel it. Her hugs, her words, and even her gestures were tinged with coldness, as if she forced herself to look after him. Inko Midoriya had resented him from the moment she learned he would be born. She blamed the situation on him, remembering the man who had left. Hisashi Midoriya had abandoned her while she was P-Arginin-T, and her family had been far away and unsupportive. She kept a smile, gave awkward embraces, and put on small displays of care. But the boy, knowing nothing else, accepted it. When people learned the name of his quirk Darkness, they labeled it villainous, and that label followed them. The boy and his mother were looked down upon, and the boy became a target. Other children his age beat him under the pretense that he was a villain, leaving him bruised and unconscious more than once, even though he had only shown the most basic manifestations of his ability. They called him monster and treated him like something strange. The boy woke one afternoon sore and slow to rise. He limped toward home, thinking he had to get there quickly because his mother might be upset if he was late. After walking a couple of blocks, he reached a modest apartment building and climbed the stairs to the second door. The sign above the entrance read Residence Midoriya, though the surname on it had been scarred as if by a knife and was barely legible. Inside, Inko appeared and offered a practiced smile, asking how his day had gone while looking at his wounds with thinly veiled indifference. The boy said he had been playing with Katsuki and other friends and tried to show a smile, though he remembered their cruelty. Inko mentioned that she would be out the next day with Mitsuki, leaving him alone in the afternoon. He said he would go take a bath, and Inko told him that dinner would be ready when he came down. As Izuku grew, so did the teasing and the mistreatment. It was no longer only Katsuki Bakugo and a few others. Much of his class joined in. His mother spoke to him less and with increasing coldness. On his 10th birthday, something broke inside the fragile routine. He arrived home with torn clothing, burns, and multiple injuries from another encounter. As he passed down the hallway toward his room, he caught sight of something in the living room that made him freeze, paralyzed with fear and shock. That view stopped him in his tracks and filled him with dread. Izuku tried to move but could not. He wanted someone to tell him it was not real. He closed his eyes as tears began to fall. He kept telling himself no, no, no as he took a few unsteady steps to the threshold of the door leading to the living room. When he opened his eyes, he managed to say no before collapsing to his knees and beginning to cry. What he found was his mother, unresponsive and suspended by a rope. The sight stopped him in place. 2 days later, Izuku stood before the newly sealed grave of his mother. Around him were the few people who had remained close to Inko, Mitsuki Bakugo and her son, Katsuki Bakugo. Mitsuki approached and hugged him while offering a few words that Izuku did not hear. He had not paid attention to anything since he had read the note that had been left on a table beside his mother's body. The note had been addressed to Izuku and written by his mother, Inko. It said that she had always hated him, that she felt he was the result of the person who had ruined her life and fled, his father. She had written that she had shown him false smiles and cold embraces and that it had never been love. She had insisted that he was the one who had ruined her life, and that she could not die in peace while he lived with a clear conscience. The note explained that she intended to end her life and declared that her final words were a single accusation. Izuku Midoriya had killed her. For a 10-year-old whose only emotional support had been the person who left that message, reading those words was devastating. The note broke him, though not completely. He felt like cracked glass on the verge of shattering. He was walking a narrow line held up by a fragile dream and by the memory of someone he had looked up to. Izuku wanted to be a hero who saved people, someone needed and loved, someone like All Might, the symbol of peace and the greatest hero. That dream kept him going. He endured beatings and insults, but he stayed on that thin line and kept moving forward. He relied on the idea of becoming a hero to pull him through, not knowing that the very person he depended on would ultimately be the one to push him. Izuku was 14 and in his third year of middle school. That day the teacher spoke to the class about the future and how important this moment was. The teacher urged them to think carefully about the decisions they would make, tossing papers into the air and keeping one for emphasis, and noted that everyone wanted to be heroes. The students activated their quirks and cheered with excitement. Katsuki Bakugo cut across the noise, ordering the others to be quiet and declaring that the only one who would be a hero in that class would be him. The teacher reminded Bakugo that he wanted to apply to UA, and Bakugo rose to his desk to assert that he would become the #1 hero and surpass All Might. The teacher turned mockingly to Izuku and asked if he really wanted to apply to UA, laughing as the question spread through the room. A cruel laugh broke out and soon the entire classroom was laughing at Izuku. He lowered his head, trying to hide, but Bakugo would not let him disappear into silence. Bakugo leapt and unleashed an explosion that sent Izuku crashing into a wall and to the floor. Bakugo advanced in a threatening manner, unleashing blasts from his palms and hurling insults as he attacked. Izuku could not react. He took the blows and explosions, and when he searched for help he saw everyone watching with mocking pleasure, even the teacher. He refused to call for aid. An hour later, Izuku walked through a tunnel and then collapsed to the ground. He was badly hurt with burns and bruises. He crawled along the wall and sat, wincing as he looked at his injured leg. After a few minutes of rest, he told himself to stay calm. Resentment might have been expected from someone who had been humiliated and beaten so often, but Izuku had convinced himself that a true hero did not hold grudges. He pushed his anger aside and resumed his journey home, hoping to arrive without more trouble. From a nearby sewer, a slick, green substance with a single floating eye shot out. A mud-like villain emerged and regarded Izuku, considering whether he might be useful. A sudden voice commanded the villain to stop, and a figure leaped out of the sewer. The hero All Might arrived and delivered a powerful strike, using a great blow that generated a shockwave. The shock scattered the villain and sent Izuku rattling into a wall, leaving him dazed. All Might stepped forward and apologized for the impact, asking if Izuku was all right. Izuku was stunned to see the symbol of heroism standing before him. He reacted in surprised awe when he realized who had come to his aid. All Might laughed in his booming way and explained that he had been pursuing the villain. He produced a bottle and, with a practiced movement, trapped the villain inside it. After ensuring the situation was under control, All Might listened to Izuku's timid question about whether someone whose quirk only brought misfortune to others could still be a hero. All Might paused and then answered directly that, in his view, a person whose quirk caused harm and who could not control it could not become a hero. He expressed sincere regret, placed a supportive hand on Izuku's shoulder, and then departed with a powerful jump. The words hung in the air like a weight. Izuku stood frozen for several minutes, expressionless, and then walked home like someone moving through a fog, limping and exhausted. At his house he dropped his bag and went up to his room, which was filled with posters and figures of All Might, smiles that now felt hollow to him. He stood before a life-sized statue of the hero and asked why All Might could not spare him a kinder answer. Overcome with anger and pain, he began to tear down everything that reminded him of the hero. Amid the wreckage he found a large kitchen knife. Memories of a dark thought from months before flickered through his mind. For a moment he brought the blade to his wrist, but then he pulled back and gave an empty, chilling smile. He told himself that this was not the way and began to consider something he imagined would be quicker. He pointed the knife at his stomach and tried to stab himself. Shadows stopped the blade before it could pierce him, pulling it away until he let go. Izuku looked to his side and saw a black book floating, open to a random page with letters that glowed. Flashback after the quirk diagnosis. A few days had passed since they told him what his quirk was, and it was not public yet. The young boy still had doubts and kept trying to activate it. In a moment when frustration and hope merged, he finally manifested it. A sizable black book appeared in his hands, its cover marked with a golden letter I. As a small child he reacted with surprise and joy, though he did not know what it was for. The way he learned its nature, however, came in the worst possible context. And flashback. Back in the present, Izuku stared at the book with surprise that turned into pure hatred. After a few seconds he tried again to harm himself, but the shadows intervened once more. He blamed the book through tears, declaring that because of it he had not been able to live and now it would not let him die. The shadows prevented him again and again. Despite his screams and sobs, the knife never reached him. Unseen by Izuku, Shigaraki had been watching from the threshold of the room for several minutes, wearing a smile that suggested something unhinged while holding a notebook. Shigaraki had been walking through alleys toward an address Kurogyari had given him to buy supplies. As he neared a tunnel he heard the symbol of peace, attacking a villain, and recognized one of the grandiose names the hero used for his punches. He paused. A kid suddenly flew against a nearby wall and something fell from the boy's backpack. A conversation began between the boy and the acclaimed hero. Shigaraki had intended to leave, but a question from the boy caught his attention: whether a person could be a hero even if their quirk only brought misfortune to others. Even as a villain, Shigaraki noticed the genuine hope and desperation in those words. The hero answered harshly and left, and Shigaraki watched the kid stagger away, badly hurt and covered in burns and wounds. The boy walked like a wounded figure. Shigaraki picked up the fallen notebook and grimaced at its title, Analysis of Heroes for the Future No. He flipped through it and found the boy to be a devoted fan, but his analyses were surprisingly insightful. Shigaraki followed him home. When the boy entered without closing the door, Shigaraki slipped inside and saw that the house was shadowy. He followed the boy into his room, watched him break things, and then saw him take a knife and point it at his stomach with a terrible resolve. At that moment the black book appeared at the boy's side and opened, and shadows rose to stop the blade. Shigaraki concluded that the book and the shadows must be the boy's quirk. The boy continued trying to harm himself in desperation. Shigaraki took the opportunity to leave and call Kurogyari, thinking the boy might be useful and that his mentor could handle him if he refused cooperation. Later that night, Izuku's screams had stopped, but he still attempted to hurt himself in quieter, less frantic ways. He let go of the knife and asked himself why it had to be him, collapsing and hugging his knees as he cried softly, saying he had only wanted to be a hero and to be loved. A purple portal opened beneath him and transported him to a place that looked like a bar. Before he could react, a man who had watched him earlier spoke, asking whether Izuku did not think the world was unfair and whether he was not angry at how unjust things had been to him. Izuku admitted that he was and, frightened and confused, asked who the man was and why he had been brought there. The man said his identity did not matter at that moment. What mattered was who Izuku was. As he stepped closer, his appearance became clearer. He looked young, with white hair, red eyes, and very dry skin. A purple mist with yellow eyes and a suit admonished the white-haired man for being too blunt and warned that he would give a bad impression. The mist apologized to Izuku and said it would take him to meet the person who would introduce them and explain everything. Another portal opened and carried Izuku to a dark room lit only by screens, where a chair stood out. A voice from the chair told Izuku that Shigaraki had spoken about him and that the voice holder agreed. A hand displayed the notebook and praised the boy's quirk analysis as impressive. Izuku could not find words. The compliment lingered in his mind. The man in the chair invited the boy to come closer. The chair turned, revealing a man connected to several tubes with only a clearly visible mouth. The man reached out his arm and urged Izuku not to be afraid, asking him to show who he was. Izuku did not know why, but he stepped forward. When he was close enough, the man's hand rested on his forehead and, in a quick flash, Izuku saw his entire past. He collapsed to his knees. A mysterious voice observed Izuku's hard life with pity and offered his hand as help, asking if it was time for Izuku to become his own hero. Izuku reacted with tears, rising to look at the man and wondering if he could really be a hero. The man confirmed that Izuku could, but added that he would be interested in having him work with the League of Villains. Startled and afraid, Izuku asked why the League would want his help. The man explained that Izuku's analyses of quirks were impressive. He said heroes and villains did not simply represent good and evil and that they, too, could feel pity and wish to help others. Izuku had suffered discrimination for having a quirk. In the League he would not have to face that. They offered him a place to be safe and away from his old life in exchange for his analyses and services when needed. Izuku worried that becoming a villain would give those who had rejected him vindication. The man questioned whether being a villain was truly wrong and pointed out corrupt heroes who cared only for themselves. He argued that wanting to belong to something was understandable and that, if Izuku had been denied the right to become a hero and to live a normal life, choosing to be a villain could be a way to claim agency. He extended his hand again. Izuku rose and accepted the offered hand, not knowing that he was also accepting a life for which he might not be prepared. The man introduced himself as All for One and asked to be called Sensei. He identified the purple-misted figure as Kurojairi and the white-haired young man Izuku had seen in the bar as Tamura Shigaraki. Izuku asked nervously where he would stay, whether at his old home or somewhere else. All for One said they would provide a place to live and, with a smooth but unsettling suggestion, proposed burning Izuku's house and everything in it to mark a new beginning. After a hesitant affirmative response from Izuku, All for One told him that Kurojairi would assign a room and that he should rest. Tomorrow they would define his duties and future with the League. Izuku bade farewell to All for One and was taken by Kurojairi through a portal to his new home. He did not care much about the place. He was exhausted and went straight to sleep. So much had happened that day. His dream of heroism had been denied. He had tried to end his life and been stopped by his quirk. He had been brought through a portal to someone who appreciated an act he had done, and that person had invited him to join the League of Villains, an invitation he had accepted. With all that weighing on him, he fell asleep. Meanwhile, All for One sat again in his chair with Tamura and Kurojairi behind him. Kurojairi, speaking with great respect, suggested that All for One might have been too flexible. All for One replied that the boy had suffered greatly and that sometimes an animal that had been healed became more effective than one forced into SB. Tamura, annoyed, wondered why Izuku had not simply been controlled with a quirk. All for One answered in a dictatorial tone that it was easier to gain loyalty from someone who had been helped, because emotional attachment would allow their potential to be drawn out more effectively than through manipulation. He watched a camera feed of Izuku sleeping and mused about how far such a strange quirk might reach. Days passed after Izuku agreed to join the League. On the first day he received medical care and was shown the facility and the apartment All for One had bought for him. The second day passed much the same. The third day was important. Izuku was to burn his old house, along with all his possessions and memories of his former self. Today, the life he had known would end and a new one would begin. At 3:30 p.m., Kurojairi entered Izuku's apartment and called out for him. Kurojairi, also known as Black Mist, was a villain affiliated with the League and one of its leaders. He was, in truth, a pleasant person who had shown a strong affinity for Izuku. Izuku greeted Kurojairi respectfully as Mr. Kurojairi. A voice came from a room announcing that someone would be there in a second. After a few moments, Izuku appeared with a changed appearance. His dark green hair had turned black with gray at the tips, though his green eyes and freckles remained. He carried a can that smelled of gasoline and a backpack. Kurojairi observed that Izuku was ready, added that he would send money later for clothes, and urged him to hurry. Izuku stepped through the portal and arrived in a forest. Kurojairi adopted his humanoid form and said he would leave Izuku there, instructing him to return to the agreed spot and report back once he had completed what he needed to do. Izuku thanked him, turned, and said he would take his time, so not to worry if he was late, then began to walk. The place was familiar, the forest by the park where he had spent so much of his childhood. He remembered running across a fallen log that served as a bridge and peering into a small stream with concern for his friend Katsuki Bakugo. Those were the kind of memories that surfaced as he walked. He reached the park and saw more images from his past. When he remembered being hugged by his mother, the warmth of that memory was suddenly shadowed. Happy memories gave way to darker ones, times when classmates began to attack him because of his quirk. He recalled the adolescent Bakugo cruelly telling him that the world would be better without him. Those words echoed as he stared at the alley where they had been spoken. He continued, tracing every place where he had once cried, been struck, or insulted, each word and wound replaying in his mind. One phrase, above all, reverberated, "You cannot be a hero." When he heard it again, he knew where he stood. He arrived at the tunnel where his dream had been denied, the place where he had met the person who had given him hope to keep going. He watched a version of himself walk along that path, hurt and hopeless. After several slow minutes, he reached his destination. He had taken nearly 2 hours to make a trip that could have taken 20 minutes. It did not matter now. He had to open the door he had faced so many times. For a moment he paused, remembering how he always stopped there before forcing himself to enter. He pushed the door and met the familiar, silent reception that greeted him every afternoon. Out of the corner of his eye, he caught the memory of finding his mother in that same place years ago, and the painful recollection returned without graphic detail. He climbed the worn stairs he knew so well and moved down the dim, dusty hallway that time had faded from its earlier brightness. He entered the place that had been his temple and refuge for years, his room. Everything was as it had been the day Kurojairi took him to the bar, all Might figures and posters torn and scattered across the floor and in the trash. Amid the disarray lay a knife. He looked at it for a moment, tempted to pick it up and see if anything would be different this time, but he stopped when a book reappeared. Izuku smirked and asked the book if he was that obvious. He set down the can he had been carrying, took 2 more from his backpack, and tossed one into his room. He then poured gasoline around the house, methodically emptying each container and walking through every room to leave traces of the liquid, finally opening the gas valves in the kitchen. He told himself, recalling his teacher's words, that this was a way to restart his life, a clean slate. He gathered several lighters and matches and arranged them with a few small explosive devices. The first small detonation would ignite the gas accumulated in the house, triggering a larger explosion that would set the spilled gasoline alight. He moved away quickly, because that initial spark would come first. From the sidewalk, he heard the first small explosion and almost immediately a larger one. He noted that it had happened faster than he expected and watched smoke begin to rise from the broken windows. He thought this might be his goodbye to the place and walked away slowly, the memories both painful and joyful seeming to be consumed as he looked back, fading like ash. By evening, Izuku was back in the forest. He had taken his time but was finished. The only evidence that the house had once existed were the ashes left behind. He called Kurojairi and waited at the agreed point. After a while, Kurojairi appeared and was not alone. Tamura emerged from the portal, greeting Izuku in a casual, almost mocking way, and said that Sensei wanted to speak with both of them. Izuku agreed quietly, taking one last look at the forest and thinking it would likely be the last time he would see it, then followed the albino through the portal. They arrived at the bar, the same place where Izuku had first fallen through the portal. Izuku wondered whether they were going to meet Sensei in person. Tamura clarified that they would be speaking with Sensei and that Sensei had things to clarify with Izuku as he headed toward a television. For a few seconds only static could be heard in the empty room, until the screen came to life. Fo greeted Izuku with his eerie voice and noted that if Izuku was already there then he must have done what was required. Izuku approached the television and, kneeling slightly, expressed his gratitude again for the opportunity. AFO said it was unnecessary for Izuku to thank him so much and asked to get to the main topic, He needed to clarify matters regarding Izuku's training, job proposals, and any conditions he might have. Izuku stood and asked if the training referred to physical conditioning in addition to his quirk. AFO confirmed that Izuku would train physically with some help from Kurogyri, while combat skills would be supervised by someone AFO knew, once Izuku's physical condition improved. Izuku turned and thanked Mr. Kurogyri in advance with a slight bow. He then addressed the screen again and made clear that his role would include analyzing quirks of both heroes and villains and serving as a field agent when requested. AFO smiled and said that was exactly what he wanted to hear, then requested Izuku also focus on scientific matters, developing support devices to improve their performance. Izuku agreed to that as long as the necessary materials were provided. FO then asked if Izuku had any conditions, whether things he would refuse or things he wanted to do. Izuku's expression sharpened as he stated a simple condition. He would not kill, and he did not want to be forced to do so. Tamura sprang up from the couch in outrage, demanding how Izuku could claim to be a villain but refuse to kill. AFO interrupted calmly and told Tamura to be quiet, explaining that Izuku's decision must be respected and that it would not necessarily affect his duties. He also pointed out that Izuku was quite useful and that this detail was minor compared to what Izuku could accomplish. Izuku knelt again and promised that his decision would not affect his functions in the league. AFO reassured him that the decision was understandable and then instructed Kurogyri to take Izuku to his apartment, mentioning that the next day would be busy for him. Izuku said his goodbyes and was escorted back to his home. Tamura, still angry, demanded to know why Izuku was being coddled and why he had been given so much. AFO replied imperiously that there was no problem with it and that Izuku's usefulness made the matter insignificant. Tamura grunted and admitted he had the uneasy feeling that Izuku seemed like a different person. AFO explained that the answer was simple. Today Izuku had died and been reborn, erasing his past, so his previous self had to die as well. He added that this was only the beginning and that Izuku already felt a strong commitment to the league, that gratitude made him a far more dangerous piece than the others. Darkness was the name of Izuku's quirk. He knew very little about it. The report he received at 4 years old had been vague, mentioning only the formation of objects from shadow. Izuku had never wanted to study or use it, so this day marked the first time in years that he planned to activate it again. A few days after Izuku first noticed the mysterious black book, he had discovered that most of its pages were blank. A few sheets were filled with strange runes he could not understand. That did not matter in the moment because today was a family picnic organized by Izuku's preschool. His mother had not been eager to attend but went because she loved her son. At the event, parents talked while children played and some demonstrated just manifested quirks. Izuku enjoyed the games of tag until boredom drove him toward a group watching a boy display his ability. The boy boasted that he could extend his nails into claws and began slashing through the air to show off. Izuku moved in to get a better look. The children scattered to avoid a stray swipe. Izuku did not react in time. Shadows erupted from the ground and formed spear-like shapes that struck the boy. The attack pinned the child in place in a sudden, startling flash of dark energy. Izuku stood nearby, dazed and holding the black book with a golden eye on its cover, his expression empty. Adults reacted in panic and pushed through the crowd. From that day forward, Izuku was labeled a villain. Over the years, most people, strangers and acquaintances alike, learned the story and judged him without having been there. Izuku tried to explain what had really happened, but nobody believed him or listened. Back in the present, Izuku prepared to use his quirk again. He had been training his body, and his teacher had insisted that the quirk itself needed exercise like a muscle. It had to be worked, strained, allowed to recover, and developed a cycle that would only complete with consistent effort. Izuku looked at his hands and concentrated, remembering how the book had appeared in the past. The large black book with a golden eye materialized again. He examined it carefully, trying to analyze what he had been incapable of as a child. He reasoned that, in theory, he could create things from darkness using the book's runes. He wondered why the book seemed to appear when his life was in danger and why it had acted differently in other critical moments in his past. The book almost seemed to have a will of its own, coming into being when Izuku's life was at risk. Using that intuition, he began a cautious phase of training and exploration to understand his quirk. Days later, exhausted and sweating from his routine, Izuku lay on the floor staring at the ceiling. He had been thinking about a fire that had been reported on a giant screen in the street while he was jogging, a blaze in his neighborhood that had consumed several apartment buildings. 7 residences had been affected, and though no one had died, the event haunted him. He worried that if anyone had died, he would have broken a promise he had made to himself. A week passed and Izuku made visible progress. He had learned the basics of manifesting and manipulating shadow constructs by writing runes from the book. He could now summon shadows at will, although complications remained. The quirk, darkness, allowed him to conjure shadow forms through the runes that the book contained by nature of his connection to it. Izuku did not only train alone. At his teacher's request, he went out to observe people, studying quirks of both heroes and villains. He followed targets, took notes on capabilities, weaknesses, and potential improvements, a task he was passionate about despite the risks. The most dangerous assignment so far had been investigating Enji Todoroki, also known as Endeavor. The danger stemmed from how forcefully Endeavor fought. His attacks were overwhelming and indiscriminate in the heat of battle. During one observation, Izuku had barely avoided a direct blast of flame. After compiling his findings, Izuku's teacher told him that his report was sufficient for now. Izuku felt annoyed that so much risk and effort had resulted in a brief conclusion, but over time he came to understand the reasoning behind his teacher's decision. It was his job and orders were orders, so he decided to overcome that small annoyance and abandon the idea of getting angry about such things, since he had accepted all of it. 1 month later, Izuku's progress was impressive. Physically, he had never been particularly athletic, but after a month of hard daily training he was already noticeably above average. This improvement would soon open the door to the next phase of his training, combat skills. His mentor had said that once he reached the required physical condition, he would begin training him in combat and mobility. The progress was not only physical. Izuku had nearly mastered the basics of his quirk. He could summon shadows without much trouble and use them with relative ease. The more complex aspects were still difficult. He had only recently begun to understand what the doctor meant by invoking things through shadows. The shadows were only the raw material he had to shape, and the book he possessed functioned as the means to perform the actual summons. For now he could only create what was already written in the book, basically the 2 basic functions, to protect and to heal. He would need to discover how to do more. Later, Izuku sat at the bar, talking with Kurojiri because his mentor had asked him to come. Izuku asked Kurojiri, still looking at a shelf, whether he knew the reason the mentor had summoned him. Kurojiri admitted he had no idea, but he reminded Izuku that whatever the need, he should always come when called. Izuku acknowledged this, rose from his seat and lay back on a sofa, then wondered aloud where Tamura was, since he had not seen him around. Kurojiri explained that Tamura was the public face of the league and was the one who attended underworld meetings. Izuku reflected that their mentor was very shrewd, trying to develop Tamura as a leader and eventual successor as the next symbol of evil. Kurojiri commented that it was no surprise the mentor had accepted Izuku, noting with a certain pride that Izuku was intelligent and quick to deduce things. Izuku replied that it had been an easy deduction. The mentor intended to use him as an executor for Tamura, because every king needed an enforcer. Kurojiri responded awkwardly, and Izuku reassured him not to worry, saying that although their mentor used him, at least the mentor accepted and supported him. He smiled, and his smile was so pure and radiant that it tightened Kurojiri's chest. Seeing someone find happiness for the reasons Izuku did was a painful thing to witness. A few weeks later, Izuku began combat training. The next day his mentor introduced him to the person who would be his instructor, a woman named Am. Izuku remembered sitting across from Kurojiri as the portal opened that took him to the mentor's office. The mentor greeted him warmly and complimented his progress over the month. Izuku humbly insisted he had only improved a little and then asked where his trainer was. A voice from behind told him she had been there all along, and Izuku realized he had not yet developed basic perception skills. He admitted this was unsurprising, since he had been focusing on physical training. When he turned, he was surprised to see the woman who addressed him was quite small, even shorter than he was. The mentor introduced her as the best assassin in the underworld, Amber, also known as Death. Amber was no taller than 1.60 meters, and her face looked roughly 20 years old. Her hair was short and intensely red, and her crimson eyes regarded him with a very intimidating stare. Amber examined him from head to toe and remarked that he seemed to be a kid she would have to train, though his physical condition was good. Izuku bowed politely and said it was a pleasure to meet her. Amber smirked in a sadistic way and noted that a polite boy would save her the trouble of having to teach him manners by force. That day was a few weeks in the past, and Izuku found himself missing the days before Amber's training. Despite her slight build, she was extremely strong and skilled. She told him she was about 35 and had spent more than half her life training and working in assassination, specializing in both stealth and direct combat. She was exceptionally proficient in close-quarters fighting. Her training had focused on developing Izuku's senses and the basic fluidity of his combat skills. Izuku struggled to defend himself against the small woman's strikes. Her punches and kicks were as powerful as those of someone with a physical enhancement quirk. Between attacks, Izuku tried to counterattack and was rewarded only with more blows. That was the routine. They worked on his senses and then fought. 3 months later, nearly 5 months since Izuku had joined the league, he continued to spar with Amber. He often took the brunt of the damage and appeared bruised and battered, but during one exchange he landed a strong punch to Amber's face and made her step back. Izuku taunted that they had barely begun, showing a bit of arrogance. Amber observed that he had improved a great deal in that time, but she was far from finished. Amber drew a knife and warned him not to be overconfident. Before Izuku could form a word, a blade was already aimed at his neck. His shadows absorbed the blow, and when he looked for his teacher, she was gone. Amber explained in the training room that the basic technique of assassination was the ability to conceal oneself completely, a skill that was very difficult to master. Several knives flew toward Izuku and were repelled by his shadows. Amber remarked that finding someone in such a state was even harder, and more knives were thrown, one connected with Izuku's leg. He winced and told himself to concentrate, to sense the environment and become one with it. He relaxed and focused. 5 months later, Izuku and Amber trained again. They were far more evenly matched now, trading hand-to-hand strikes at a comparable pace. Izuku's appearance had changed considerably during the 10 months he had been with the league. His body was more robust, taller, and more defined. Scars marked the exposed areas of his arms, hands, and face. His features seemed older, though the freckles that gave him a youthful hint remained. His green eyes had lost some of their brightness, turning a duller shade, and his hair had been cut short and dyed black. His personality had shifted as well. He was more serious and confident, and he had picked up harsher tendencies from his teacher, Amber, who had influenced some of his behaviors. Amber had decades of experience with her quirk and used it with practiced mastery. Izuku, relying on intellect, perseverance, and deduction, had developed creative uses for his own quirk. He could transform his book into a sword or staff and summon shadowy figures to support him in combat. During a pause in training, Izuku asked Amber if she knew the hero killer Stain. Amber said she did and asked why he was asking. Izuku explained that Kurojiiri had mentioned Tamura's interest in Stain, so he thought Amber might have a connection. Amber responded curtly that the boy should give up on Stain. She did not consider Kaizomi an ally and was confident he would never join the league. Amber then grew serious and asked Izuku to sit. She said she had been training with him for almost 9 months and had begun losing her rhythm in her regular work. She told him she would have to leave. She had accepted a deal with All for One. She placed a hand on his head and said she had taught him everything she could. The rest was experience he still needed. She believed his current level would be sufficient to face Stain, at least if quirks were not taken into account. Izuku bowed his head, thanked her for everything she had done, and apologized for taking so much of her time. Amber reassured him that the decision was hers and that she had accepted the arrangement willingly. She promised she would return occasionally and, pressing her hand harder against his head, warned him not to become weak in her absence. Izuku stammered his agreement and struggled to free himself from her grip. Izuku sat in one of the sofas at the league's bar, sipping coffee and reviewing notes on quirks he had observed during the day when a Kurogyri portal opened and Tamura stepped through. Izuku greeted Tamura without looking up and asked how recruitment had gone, still focused on his notebook. Tamura cursed and collapsed into another sofa, annoyed, and reported that recruitment had been terrible. He could find many recruits but none better than a C+ rank. Izuku closed his notebook and observed that if all they had was quantity, they would have to make the most of it. Tamura agreed begrudgingly and added that the Nomu their leader had provided should be enough for their objective. Izuku noted with a small smile that the objective was to kill the symbol of peace, and reminded Tamura that this was Tamura's responsibility. The two fell into planning. A few days earlier, the students of the prestigious UA High School had returned for the new year. This year was special because All Might himself was teaching, drawing a swarm of journalists to the gates trying to get information. Taking advantage of that distraction, Tamura used his quirk to let the press into the campus, creating chaos and allowing time to gather intelligence. He discovered that Class 1A, the Hero course, would be holding a special activity in a remote area of the academy with only 3 pro heroes present. The 3 pro heroes assigned were Eraserhead, a pro specialized in urban environments with a deceptively simple quirk, Rescue Hero 13, whose quirk was powerful for saving lives but had limited use in direct combat, and All Might, the greatest threat because of his tremendous strength, speed, and endurance. All for One advised Tamura to attack at that moment, calling it a perfect opportunity to eliminate the symbol of peace. All for One had supplied a Nomu, a bioengineered human designed with 4 integrated quirks tailored to counter All Might, but even that might not be enough. Tamura set out to recruit villains for the operation. Kurogyri interrupted the planning to ask Izuku whether he had already acquired a costume and an alias. Izuku replied that he had the costume but was unsure if wearing a mask was necessary. He had some ideas for an alias. His favorite so far was Crow. Tamura laughed mockingly and suggested simply using his real name. Izuku considered that but thought it would spoil the fun of remaining hidden. Kurogyri asked why Izuku resisted a mask when he wanted anonymity. Izuku explained that he could dye his hair, use contact lenses, and that makeup would cover his freckles. Tamura asked if Izuku had reviewed the student list and their quirks. Izuku said he planned to review it later to organize a strategy for the next day, but when Kurogyri pointed out that the lists were on a nearby laptop, Izuku went to fetch it and returned to the sofa to open the computer. He read through Class 1A. Tfyu Azui, Frog. Mina Ishido, Acid. Yugoyama, Laser. Tenya Ida, Engine. Achiko Uraraka, Zero Gravity. Mashireo Ojiro, Till. Denki Kaminari, Electrification. Ijiro Kirishima, Hardening. Koji Koda, Animal Voice. Hanta Siro, Tape. Kyokajiro, Earphone Jack. Rikido Sato, Sugar Rush. Mizo Shoji, Duplicate Arms. Shoto Todoroki, Half Cold Half Hot. Minoru Mineta, Pop Off. Momo Yayarozu, Creation. Fumikage Tokoyami, Dark Shadow. Melissa Shield, Super Strength. Toru Hagakure, Invisibility. Katsuki Bakugo, Explosion. As Izuku read the brief descriptions, he smiled when he reached the last entry. He did not need to review Bakugo's quirk because he knew him well enough for the information to be redundant. He closed the laptop with a look of disgust, reflecting that Bakugo had indeed been accepted into UA, something he felt Bakugo did not deserve. Kurogyri prompted Izuku to share his thoughts about the roster. Izuku responded that they needed to separate the students into different areas to complicate the use of their quirks. Beyond that, the outcome would depend on how the villains handled themselves and how the students adapted. He suggested that 13 could be handled easily, that the Nomu should be assigned to deal with All Might, and that Eraserhead could be worn down by making him fight for extended periods since Eraserhead's quirk was not suited for long battles. Tamura could finish Eraserhead after he was exhausted. Tamura admitted surprise at how quickly Izuku had planned everything and asked if any student could present a real problem. Izuku assessed that 4 or 5, perhaps 6, students could threaten them alone, and that groups would be more troublesome. He listed those 6 as Shoto Todoroki, Katsuki Bakugo, Eijiro Kirishima, Fumikage Tokoyami, Melissa Shield, and Tenya Ida. Kurogyari asked if Izuku had any ideas for nullifying any of them. Izuku told the others that he would handle Bakugo, Kirishima, and Tokoyami without much difficulty. He warned that Shield was a potential threat because using her quirk could cause a lot of damage, but the other two were more complex problems he could manage. Tamura responded lazily that would be all for now and said they would speak with their teacher the next day, then he settled down to sleep. The next day in Izuku's apartment, tools, clothes, notebooks, and books were scattered everywhere. One piece of furniture stood orderly, a desk where Izuku worked, sharpening a knife. He muttered Kaken under his breath as he honed the blade and, with a flash of frustration, drove the knife into the desk. He admitted to himself that he hated Kaken, yet also felt he could never bring himself to kill him. That dilemma had haunted Izuku since he joined the League. The quick answer was that he could become a villain but not an assassin. That answer brought another question. What would be wrong with being an assassin? He had never promised anyone, not even himself, to remain a hero. In theory, there would be nothing wrong with that. Tamura had called him a coward, and maybe the label stung because of that uncertainty. Deep down he knew the truth. Despite everything that had happened, he still wanted to be a hero and longed to save people with a smile. But normal society had already rejected him, his idol had denied him, and the villains were the ones who had accepted him. He owed a great deal to Tamura and their teacher, so that dream could no longer be seriously pursued. Later at the bar, Izuku examined the Nomu standing 3 meters tall in the middle of the room. He found it impressive and briefly considered using it as a test subject for his serums, then climbed onto it. Kurogyari reminded him that their teacher had forbidden such experiments because if they went out of control they could be dangerous. Izuku opened the creature's mouth to inspect its teeth and observed that it could easily overpower a human with its bite. Tamura appeared through a doorway and sternly told Izuku to stop playing with it. Kurogyari asked how many villains Izuku had managed to gather. Tamura flopped onto a couch and reported that they had around 60 or 70 in total, though only about 6 reached the range B level, which disappointed him. Izuku pointed out that they had not asked much. The assignment was simply to take down Eraserhead or at least exhaust him, and to prevent the students from intervening. Tamura noted that All Might would probably try to go after them first, and Izuku suggested a simple tactic. If Kurogyari could disperse the students, they should send the Nomu straight at All Might without giving him time to react. Kurogyari sat nearby and asked how to get rid of 13. Izuku explained that provoking him and threatening him a bit would be enough. Let 13 attack with his black hole ability and when he got close to absorb, create a portal near him or on one of his limbs so he would effectively attack himself. Kurogyari considered that and then asked Tamura whether he had told the villains to gather at specific points. Tamura admitted that he had instructed them to assemble in alleys and similar locations. Izuku declared that everything was set. They had spoken with their teacher, the plan was in place, and roles were distributed. He left to work on several tasks before the next day. The day arrived. Izuku and the League of Villains would launch a surprise attack on Class 1A at their own academy with the objective of eliminating the symbol of peace, All Might. The students were scheduled to be on a rescue practice mission at a facility with many disaster zones known by the initials USJ. Izuku sat astride the Nomu's shoulders while Kurogyari, Tamura, and 6 other villains the Class B rogues Shigaraki had recruited waited in the bar for specific instructions. Izuku had altered his appearance for the operation. He had temporarily dyed his hair a pale white gray with dark smudges, fitted black contact lenses, used makeup to conceal his freckles, and donned a costume. He carried his book in physical form but modified into a staff. Tamura checked the time and said it was time to move. He reminded everyone to prevent the students from interfering and, if possible, capture some. Kurogyari opened a large purple portal and stepped through first, followed by 6 villains, and then the Nomu advanced on Izuku's orders. As they walked, more villains arrived in a kind of staging area until Tamura led the way across to the other side. Izuku was the last to pass through while still seated on Nomu, after which the portal closed. Izuku looked up and saw the students, mostly frightened, while the heroes watched them with serious expressions. Kurogyari materialized and conveyed uncertainty that All Might was not present. Tamura expressed annoyance and disappointment that they had gone to the trouble of setting everything up only to find that All Might was not there. Then he paused and considered the next move. A pale villain suggested that maybe the symbol of peace would come if they killed a few of his students, his tone almost psychopathic as he finished speaking. As he finished, Eraserhead put on his goggles and charged into the crowd of villains gathered in the central plaza. Izuku observed that All Might would most likely arrive later as he dismounted from the Nomu. He instructed Kurogyari to take care of Eraserhead and asked if they should proceed. At that, Izuku began to fade into a swirl of black feathers that seemed to drift with the wind toward where the students were. When the feathers reached them, they gathered and materialized, Izuku appearing beside Kurogyari between the exit door and the students. Kurogyari greeted the future heroes, presenting himself and the League of Villains and stating, in a courteous but threatening tone, that they were there to make the symbol of peace take his last breath. He added that, according to their information, the symbol of peace should have been there and asked why things had changed. Bakugo stepped forward and angrily declared that killing All Might was impossible, certain that such a thing could not happen. A red-haired student whom Izuku recognized as Kirishima asserted that they would not allow it and challenged the villains by asking if the heroes had considered that they would have to defeat the heroes first. Tracy thought that Izuku looked quite young as he stepped forward in front of the students and warned everyone to stand back, announcing that he would handle the villains and pointing his arm toward the duo. Izuku warned Tracy that he was being impulsive and that he would not be so confident in acting like that. Tracy asked why he should listen to a villain, and Izuku replied with a smile that he should not. At that moment, Kurogyari extended into a mist that enveloped most of the students, making several of them vanish in an instant. When Kurogyari returned to his normal form, Izuku noted that at least 7 students remained, including Tenya Ida and the hero. Izuku observed that Kurogyari had not managed to take all of them but expressed confidence that Kurogyari and the hero together could handle the situation. He said he would take care of his own part and then faded into feathers again, which drifted toward a zone of ruined buildings as he thought to himself that he would go after Katsuki first with a sadistic smile. Izuku then entered the top floor of the building where Katsuki was supposed to be. He did not need to confirm his presence because the sound of explosions and shouts several floors below made that clear. Expecting the villains to hold out for a while, he decided to head down the stairs while idly swinging his cane. On the first floor, 8 minutes later, many villains lay on the ground, some beaten and others with burn marks, while Kirishima and Bakugo stood amid them. Kirishima noted that those seemed to be all of their opponents and urged that they hurry and help the others. Bakugo dismissed their concern, insisting that those villains were not strong enough to beat people like them. Footsteps and a small laugh echoed from the staircase, and both students fell silent and took up defensive stances, watching the stairs. Izuku appeared on the stairs and taunted them, questioning whether all the villains were as weak as they thought and pointing out one fallen villain on the floor. Bakugo snarled that the blow Izuku had given him at the entrance had hurt and that Izuku would pay for it, preparing to attack. As Bakugo launched an explosive attack, Izuku noted inwardly how predictable Bakugo always was, dodged the blast, moved behind him, kicked him toward a wall, and scolded him for attacking from behind when he was only trying to be courteous. Kirishima launched himself at Izuku without heeding the warning, hardening his arms and attempting to strike. Izuku avoided every attack. Before Kirishima could recover, Izuku used the end of his cane to shift the red-haired student's footing, leaving him suspended inches off the ground, then kicked him into Bakugo, who was getting up and took the full impact from his friend's body. Izuku introduced himself as Crow with a bow. Bakugo snapped that he did not care about the name. A villain stood and shouted that the other was just another obstacle on his path to become number 1, but Izuku struck him before he could finish. Izuku's anger at those words, which did not match the man's actions, drove him to act. Izuku's strike was only the beginning. He launched a frantic barrage of punches and kicks, and with blows from his staff he kept driving the ash-haired assailant back, who could not recover and failed to remain in the fight. Kirishima's attempt to hit Izuku interrupted Izuku's assault on Bakugo, and the assault's pause allowed a dazed Bakugo to stagger back to his feet, leaving Izuku facing both of them. Izuku smiled briefly and thought that at last they were attacking him together. It was time to move on to the next opponents. Without hesitation, both boys charged at him, ignoring the cloud of dust Izuku had raised by striking the ground with his staff, which nearly blinded them. Bakugo, regaining some awareness, raised his gauntlet and prepared to pull the trigger toward where he believed Izuku to be. Izuku's voice came from the dust that surrounded him, noting that they were too predictable. Bakugo pulled the trigger before realizing that Izuku had used Kirishima as a shield. It was too late. A massive blast erupted from the gauntlet, engulfing Kirishima and Izuku and blasting the ash-haired attacker away. The explosion was so powerful that its rumble echoed through the complex, alarming some and leaving others indifferent. After about a minute, the dust cleared, revealing most of the first floor in ruins with a large crater in the center. In the crater lay a red-haired figure, gravely injured and unconscious. On a nearby wall, Bakugo struggled to rise. Worried, he approached the wreckage and found his companion unresponsive and badly hurt. Izuku appeared at Bakugo's side and told him that he hoped the incident had been a lesson, then said goodbye to Kaken. The ash-haired attacker opened his eyes wide for a moment before a blow rendered him unconscious. Izuku began to walk toward the street, thinking that he should move on to the others, but he heard Kirishima struggling to breathe and writhing nearby. He tried to tell himself it was not his problem and that Bakugo was to blame, repeating the thought in the hope of leaving the injured boy behind. After several deep breaths and more self-reassurance, he found that he could not leave. He turned and walked back to the wounded boy. Kneeling beside him, Izuku transformed his staff into a book and searched for a particular page. When he found it, he read an incantation. Shadows that had covered Kirishima's body dissolved and flowed back toward Izuku. The shadow healing technique allowed its user to mend others as well as himself. Its energy cost varied with the severity of the injury, and it required conscious activation rather than working automatically. Izuku judged that he had healed Kirishima enough for him to survive and resolved that the rest would be the responsibility of the medical team. He stood, scolding himself inwardly for feeling weak, but determined to continue his mission. To reach the central plaza more quickly, he used his dark feathers to move at speed. The central plaza of the USJ presented a grim scene. Tamura smiled with apparent triumph as he watched Eraserhead, whose arm was badly damaged, surrounded by villains. Izuku materialized beside Tamura using his dark feathers and observed that things seemed to be going well for him here. Izuku told Tamura as he walked beside him that he would go after the next target and return quickly. After saying that, he used his dark feathers to move toward a dome. Storm zone. Barely a minute later, Izuku had reached the dome. As he entered, he noticed a detail that could complicate his plan. The weather inside made the place much darker than outside. Izuku thought that Kurogyari must not have listened when told not to take the student to a dark area. He ran through the recreated city's alleys, feeling the wind and rain of the artificial storm working against him, but he also reasoned that the target's quirk might be stronger in the dark and that a surprise attack should be enough. As he searched, Izuku found Koda about to be attacked by some villains. Izuku was surprised to see a large arm of darkness erupt from a distant alley and neutralize the attackers, and then Fumikage Tokoyami appeared. Tokoyami praised Koda for his work and told him to meet up with the others as he started walking down the main street, with Koda following. They did not notice that they were being watched from above. Izuku thought that attacking from a higher vantage would be more efficient and used his dark feathers to settle on a nearby rooftop. From there, he took 2 knives from his suit pocket and aimed them toward his targets. He adjusted the aim slightly, threw them forcefully, and then used his dark feathers to move again. With Tokoyami and Koda walked together, talking normally. A knife grazed the bird-like student's cheek, startling both of them and putting them on alert. Before they could react fully, another knife flew between them. Tokoyami ordered Koda to get behind him and activated his quirk, Dark Shadow, which emerged from his back and positioned itself protectively. When Tokoyami turned, he found Koda on the ground, unconscious, and panic rose in him. He barely had time to react before black feathers swept past and everything went dark for him. From his vantage point, Izuku observed that these aspiring heroes had been caught off guard. He left Tokoyami momentarily unconscious on the ground. His plan had been to use the strong artificial wind so that, once airborne, the knives would be deflected toward the students while he appeared suddenly with his dark feathers. The surprise worked. While both were focused elsewhere, he rendered Kota unconscious and then used his dark feathers to land on Tokoyami and knock him out as well. Having accomplished 3 of his 4 objectives, Izuku now only needed to take care of Shoto Todoroki. Tenya Ida had been left with Kurojairi. Feeling a little more relaxed, Izuku decided to proceed on foot. His muscles were beginning to notice the strain from constantly using his dark feathers, and he wanted to enjoy the rain from the artificial environment. Central Plaza. Minutes later, Izuku arrived at the Central Plaza a bit delayed, having allowed himself that small indulgence. When he got there, he found a Nomu looming over Eraserhead, who looked heavily battered. Nearby, Kurojairi stood with Tamura, but Tamura did not seem cheerful. He muttered insults into the air while scratching his neck roughly. Izuku asked what was happening in a serious tone. Kurojairi admitted that Tenya Ida had slipped away because the students had executed a clever move and forced Ida to go find help. Tamura responded angrily that a whole group of professional heroes would soon arrive and that they could not simply leave without doing something. Izuku recognized this as a serious problem. He glanced at a trio of students standing at the edge of the artificial lake a few meters away and worried that it was not safe for them to be that close to Shigaraki in the state he was in. Izuku told them he would go after his next target and return in an instant. She walked away. When she left, she headed for the lake where 3 boys stood. They grew nervous, but Izuku did not look at them and passed by, pausing for a second. Izuku whispered a warning telling them to leave immediately because being near Shigaraki in his current state could put them in mortal danger. Then he continued on his way. A green-haired girl thanked Izuku. The green-haired girl told the other 2 to catch their breath, then dove into the water and swam away quickly. Izuku kept walking with no clear destination, his expression serious and almost angry. He felt frustrated because, as with Kirishima, he could not help saving those boys. He did not want to see them suffer or die, and that bothered him because his instinct to help kept interfering with the fact that he still considered himself a villain. Minutes later, Izuku ran back to the Central Plaza after hearing a loud crash at the main gate. On arriving, he was surprised to see a Kurojairi portal where Nomu and All Might were engaged, and a 2-toned-haired boy whom Izuku recognized as Shoto Todoroki. Todoroki was pressuring Kurojairi, freezing part of his form until the ice began to crack. Todoroki ordered Kurojairi to release All Might immediately or else the creature would be lost, and Kurojairi appeared to yield. All Might thanked Todoroki and requested that he refrain from further intervention. Todoroki replied that if not for him, All Might would still be trapped and refused to back down, insisting he should not be treated as before. Izuku suddenly stepped between them and urged Todoroki to listen to All Might. Both Todoroki and All Might flinched and took combat stances. Izuku warned that Todoroki could be killed if any of them landed a lethal blow, explaining that Nomu had the brute strength to kill a normal person with a single strike and indicating All Might as another example. All Might, bewildered by Izuku's appearance and tone, asked who he was. Tamura declared that All Might, the symbol of peace, was the nemesis of those kids and introduced Izuku as their aspiring villain, Crow. Izuku dismissed the formalities and said they should finish this now. He struck Nomu, who roared, and Izuku noted that the heroes would be on their way as he dismounted the beast. Tamura, frantic, ordered Nomu to kill the symbol of peace. Nomu charged without hesitation and All Might answered, launching an epic exchange of titanic punches. The blows sent gusts of wind that pushed Izuku back, and the clash was so intense the ground cracked beneath them. Although the fight seemed even at first, All Might began to gain the upper hand. Nomu was forced to retreat as All Might increased the speed and power of his strikes, pushing beyond his limits. All Might proclaimed that a true hero always overcomes adversity, drove Nomu to the ground, and then challenged the villain with a final, powerful strike, shouting to push beyond his limits. To the surprise of everyone present, Nomu, having taken hundreds of blows, was sent flying and burst through the roof. Tamura reacted in disbelief, accusing them of cheating. All Might boasted that he had not even been at his best, claiming under better conditions the defeat would have come much faster, and taunted what the villain would do next. Tamura began to show signs of strain, scratching his neck and breathing heavily as if unbalanced. Izuku urged Tamura to calm down and pointed out that All Might was not in a condition to continue fighting. He reminded Tamura that the heroes had not yet arrived and that this was his opportunity. Tamura agreed, calmer now, thanked Izuku, and rushed at All Might. Shigaraki and Kurogiri closed in on the weakened, isolated symbol of peace. Todoroki and the other students were too far away to help, convinced from a distance that All Might was fine. Suddenly, a blonde girl Izuku recognized as Melissa Shield dashed in with tremendous speed to defend All Might, badly injuring her legs in the effort. Once she reached the spot, she prepared to strike Tamura. Melissa lunged to drive Tamura away from All Might, extending her fist, but Kurogiri's portal diverted Tamura's reaching hand toward her face as he moved to touch her cheek. Unexpectedly, a shot struck Tamura's hand and halted his attack, causing him to collapse. Kurogiri and Izuku turned their attention to the gate. A suited rat perched on a hero's shoulder apologized for arriving late and explained they had gotten lost on the way. Tenya Ida, Class 1 as president, announced that he had arrived with reinforcements. The blue-haired armored boy who had escaped Kurogiri shouted, and suddenly all the pro-heroes who taught at UA gathered at the entrance. Snipe stood among them, aiming his pistol at Tamura. Snipe announced that he was going to neutralize Tamura and then fired a burst of rounds toward the albino's limbs. Before the bullets reached the villain, Izuku stepped into their path. Izuku planted his staff in the ground and produced a crimson flower that served as a shield for both of them. Izuku then told Tamura that they had to leave immediately. Tamura agreed and rose to his feet, clutching his wounded hand. Kurogiri began to form a cloud to whisk them away, but a different force started pulling all three back. 13 shouted that he would not let them escape after all they had done and activated his quirk, Black Hole, directing it at the villains. He stood with the help of nearby students who aided him in aiming his arm in the right direction. In response, Izuku quickly threw a knife with great force. The knife, assisted by 13's quirk, struck the hero's hand hard enough that the impact forced the hand back and rendered it unusable. Izuku then ordered Kurogiri to leave. As they began to be drawn into the portal, Tamura angrily asked why Izuku had not aimed for the head. Izuku replied that he did not kill, and then the portal swallowed them. Later, Izuku and his two companions reappeared at a bar. Izuku took a few steps, then collapsed and said that he needed to rest before falling asleep. Izuku found himself in a completely empty, black space. An unfamiliar voice echoed through the void and mocked him, asking if he intended to tell himself that he was not a killer. Izuku replied in a low tone that he was not a killer. The voice then demanded to know why it was dead, its anger barely contained. Izuku answered that it was because of the voice's bad choices and its weakness in facing them. The voice lashed out, insisting that Izuku was being arrogant to act indifferent toward it and claiming that burning down a house did not erase his past self. Izuku, furious, told the voice to shut up and stop chasing him. The voice taunted that its presence showed that the memory still ate at his conscience. Izuku protested that he had done nothing and only wanted love. The voice sneered that breathing itself had been his sin, that living was his crime. As a hole opened beneath Izuku and he began to fall, those last words echoed, and he woke abruptly in his bed. Hours after the events at the USJ, All for One sat in an armchair near Izuku's bed and observed that he had finally awakened, commenting that he had slept poorly. Izuku brushed it off as only a bad dream and asked what had happened, remembering only that he had arrived at the bar and fallen asleep. All for One explained that Kurogiri had brought Izuku there and that he had come personally to ask about Izuku's first official mission as a villain. Izuku, kneeling, insisted that All for One need not have troubled himself and that there was not much to report. All for One laughed and told Izuku to relax, urging him to recount the experience in detail. Izuku felt a little surprised that someone was genuinely interested in his thoughts and feelings. The warmth of that attention touched him, though a colder part of him suspected a double motive. He let his feelings take precedence and answered honestly. Izuku said he had learned 3 things. First, that it was not feasible to plan extensively without knowing the terrain. Second, that the hero candidates were not particularly strong but many had endured and even overcome the villains, and third, that he needed to train his quirk more, because relying on the dark feathers constantly and using even a single crimson flower left him exhausted. All for One replied that this was to be expected, since Izuku had only been training the quirk for a few months and was not yet accustomed to its strain. Izuku then asked permission to ask a question. All for One invited him to proceed. Izuku asked what All Might's quirk was and what history All for One had with him. All for One chuckled and pointed out Izuku's curiosity. He explained that he had lived for more than a century since quirks first appeared, and that his own power was special. It was called All for One, and it allowed him to steal other people's quirks. He went on to say that when he was younger he had almost dominated Japan, but his brother, a quirkless man to whom All for One had given a powerful quirk, opposed him and paid with his life. However, that brother had a quirk too, the ability to pass on power, so the quirk that All for One had given was planted in a successor chosen by the brother. That successor attempted to defeat All for One and failed, but he, in turn, also passed on the power. All for One revealed that the cycle had repeated for 8 generations and that All Might was the 8th bearer of the quirk known as One for All, but All Might had something special that set him apart. He had managed to defeat All for One 6 years earlier. Izuku did not know what to say. He had expected something similar to what came before, but he had never grasped how long and complex the story was. Izuku indicated that he supposed that was where the mask came from and that it explained the current state of All for One's face. All for One confirmed this and added that he would make him pay for it. Then, growing serious, All for One asked Izuku why he had healed the red-haired boy and allowed the trio at the lake to escape. The question made Izuku's skin prickle and tension fill the room. He replied that if the red-haired boy had died it would have been his fault for using him as a shield, and that he did not know why he had let the others go. All for One laughed softly and told Izuku not to be so nervous over a question whose answer he already knew. Izuku knelt and apologized, promising it would not happen again. All for One said that he was not angry at Izuku's actions. He only wanted to warn him that what he had done could be done whenever Izuku chose, but he must be certain it would not affect the League or Shigaraki. Then All for One left through a Kurogiri portal. Izuku was left alone in his apartment with a growing sense of unease about his mentor. He had known that All for One could read his mind or see his past, but he had never fully appreciated the weight of that ability. Now he understood that every action would require conscious care. More importantly, he realized he needed to be smarter than his mentor from now on. He had to keep his distance or learn how several quirks functioned. This was not about cutting ties but about a measure of security. Days later, nearly 2 weeks after Izuku had woken in his bed and had that conversation with All for One, nothing major had happened. He had spent the first day resting and had used the rest of the time to train his quirk and his body. Today, however, his training was interrupted when Shigaraki called him to the bar, saying he was needed for something important. When Izuku arrived at the bar, only Kurogiri was present. Izuku muttered and looked around, asking for Tamura. Kurogiri said Tamura should arrive in a few minutes because he had gone to speak with All for One. Kurogiri kept cleaning a glass while he explained that it was probably connected to the UA Sports Festival, which would begin the next day. Izuku settled into an armchair and suggested that Tamura would likely want him to study his quirks, hoping the meeting would not take long. Minutes later, with the bar quiet and Kurogiri gone, the door opened and Tamura entered. Izuku, somewhat irritated, stood up and demanded to know why Tamura had come. Tamura snapped that Izuku lived off them and so his job was to follow orders. He should not complain. Izuku then asked what Tamura needed. Tamura asked seriously that Izuku go to the UA Sports Festival the next day to analyze every first-year quirk and determine which ones posed potential threats based on their strength and ability. Tamura settled into an armchair as he said this. Izuku replied that he had no problem but that it would be much more convincing if he had access to some camera recordings, since he doubted he could give proper attention to so many people in such a short time. Tamura agreed and reminded him to adopt an appearance different from the one he had been seen with at the USJ. With nothing more to discuss, Izuku left the bar and went to his apartment to prepare clothes and several notebooks. There would be many quirks to analyze. On the day of the UA Sports Festival, Izuku walked through the crowd with complete calm because his current appearance was very different. His hair was now completely white, he had removed his contact lenses so his eyes were his natural green, and his freckles were hidden beneath a light layer of makeup. His clothing was less formal than the villain costume he once wore, loose, military-colored pants tucked into black combat boots and a simple black hoodie. He carried a backpack full of notebooks that the heroes and police at security did not inspect, since he showed a credential granting him access to the media zone. In that area he could view all the event cameras, which he planned to use to record and study every quirk displayed. Sensei had arranged these facilities for him and even provided a full list of the first-year students to make the task easier. The obstacle race proved immediately informative for Izuku as many quirks were put into action. He began taking notes frantically from the very start. Near the end of the race, Bakugo and Todoroki were leading and about to finish the minefield, the final test, when Melissa's shield appeared. Melissa used the mines cleverly to propel herself into first place without activating her quirk, and Izuku found that behavior particularly interesting. During the cavalry battle, Izuku continued to record everything without even pausing during the minutes Midnight gave students to organize themselves. Since the festival began, he had not stopped. He focused on quirks like Minoma Nito's copy and Momo Yaoyorozu's creation, but he kept a close eye on Melissa, who still had not shown her quirk. Then something unexpected happened. After Todoroki's team took the ribbon with their points from Melissa's team, Melissa rushed to recover it and gave a brief demonstration of her power. Izuku, who knew the technical details of her quirk but had never seen it in action, was pleasantly surprised by how interesting it was to observe. The one-on-one tournament was a televised event Izuku never missed, and he watched it closely. He considered it the most important test because it revealed the talent and potential of those recognized as the top 16 students. He observed every participant, but he was disappointed by the first round. Only 3 students showed an appropriate way to use their quirks in singular combat. Kaminari used all of his power in an early, unguarded attack without regard for his opponent's abilities. Uraraka managed to strain Katsuki through sheer perseverance but did not demonstrate refined technique. On the positive side, Todoroki, Katsuki, and Shinso showed excellent command of their powers. Even though Shinso lost, he seemed capable of defeating anyone. The second round deepened Izuku's disappointment, exposing a general lack of tactical use of quirks. Kirishima failed in an attempt to finish his match quickly. Ibra showed little cunning by attacking Ida without considering Ida's quirk. Yaoyorozu, who appeared intelligent, struggled to think fast under pressure. Melissa was the most concerning. Poor control of her power led to a harsh setback, and she was forced to withdraw from the match after sustaining an injury from mishandling her ability. Despite that, she achieved one tactical success by forcing Todoroki to rely on his fire side. In the semifinals, Izuku grew more frustrated by students who rushed into fights without coherent strategy. Both Ida and Tokoyami engaged in battles where they were at a disadvantage because they had not devised a solid plan. In the final match, Izuku felt further disappointment when Katsuki won after Todoroki appeared to give up midway, not using his fire at all. Overall, the festival had lost some of its appeal for Izuku now that he had combat knowledge. He saw students with strong quirks and great potential, but few used them to their fullest. Statistically, Todoroki and Bakugo were the only ones consistently exploiting their abilities correctly. Students like Ida, Tokoyami, Shinso, and even Melissa seemed headed in that direction, while others stood out for specific attributes, such as Ishido's physical conditioning or Kaminari's powerful attacks. So Izuku continued watching and taking detailed notes. A little while later, Izuku, with nothing else to interest him and nothing more to record, decided to leave. He began putting away his notebooks and lists of gathered information. As he prepared to go, he heard Midnight introduce All Might as the one who would present the medals. All Might appeared amid great cheers from the crowd, but the sight of his wide smile only filled Izuku with discomfort. That grin no longer brought him comfort or hope. It stirred rejection and anger instead, so he turned away and left before he might do something reckless. Later, Izuku walked through the alleys of Kamino and entered a building whose single corridor led to a door into the League's bar. When the door opened, The scene inside was unexpected for him. Kurojiri leaned against the bar looking hurt, while Shigaraki lay on the floor, also wounded. A man was on top of Shigaraki, pointing a knife at him. Izuku had no time to speak. He reacted on instinct, turning his head to avoid a knife and then flipping aside to dodge 3 knives aimed at his torso. He drew a knife from each boot and tossed his backpack aside to prepare to confront the attacker. At first he had not recognized the man, but now he knew who he faced, the hero killer Stain. Izuku identified Stain as the assassin of heroes and took a combat stance. Stain acknowledged Izuku's sharp reflexes but indicated that they would not be enough to save him as he drew a katana. Both prepared to fight, but Kurojiri called out for Izuku to wait. Izuku asked Kurojiri what was wrong and came to an abrupt halt. Stain answered angrily, beginning to ask if they wanted to continue negotiations when Shigaraki launched a quick attack that Stain had to dodge. Shigaraki, with irritation in his voice, accused them of lacking conviction but insisted they had an objective. He declared that they would kill the symbol of peace and, by doing so, change the world, his tone carrying a hint of fanaticism. Stain reacted with interest, noting that while their methods diverged, their goals aligned in some way. Shigaraki rejected the idea of an ally he considered unstable and made clear he did not want a partner he regarded as crazy. Kurojiri intervened, saying that the negotiations had been successful, and turned his attention to Stain, calling him the hero killer. Stain said he might consider the plan, then sheathed his weapon and announced that he was finished here. He asked to be taken back to Hosu because he still had work to do there. Kurojiri opened a portal and Stain stepped through, disappearing instantly and leaving the 3 others behind. Izuku sat on a sofa and asked Kurojiri why he had been following him. Kurojiri explained that he had not wanted them to kill each other. Losing either Izuku or himself would have been a serious blow, even if it did not appear that way. Izuku observed that Shigaraki did not seem to like him and watched the pale man touch a wound on his shoulder. Shigaraki erupted, declaring his hatred and insisting that the other man thought himself important when he was nothing. He stormed out and slammed the door hard as he left. Kurojiri then asked how Izuku's own mission had gone and took a seat. Izuku said it had gone very well. He produced several notebooks and described how he had studied each person, giving deeper analysis to those who had progressed furthest. Kurojiri responded that was good and said he would explain the next move they had been planning. Izuku listened, intrigued by what would come next. A few days later, Izuku lay on his bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about how quickly time moved. Almost a year had passed since he had been a very different person with a very different life. He remembered the day his idol drove a figurative knife called reality into him, telling him that if he could not understand or even feared his own power, he could not be a hero. Despite his lingering resentment, Izuku admitted to himself that all might had been right. Now he understood his quirk. He could manifest shadows and, through a book, control them to create things. His phone rang, pulling him from his thoughts. The call came from Tamura, who demanded that Izuku come to the bar wearing his villain suit and bring all his gear. The tone had been sharp and impatient. Izuku sighed, got up, and began gathering his things. Minutes later at the bar, Tamura sat at the counter, tapping his fingers anxiously. Izuku entered wearing a cloak that hid his body except for his head. The cheap dye he had used for the USJ incident had mostly faded and his hair was black again. Tamura scolded him for being late in an agitated tone. Izuku explained that he always carried many knives and that organizing them took the most time, and then asked why he had been called. Tamura complained that everyone talked about the hero killer and had completely forgotten the USJ incident. He said he wanted to do something big to steal the attention back. Kurojiri arrived with 3 Nomu in tow, one of them smaller and blacker than the one from USJ. Tamura announced that they would go to Hosu, where Stain operated, and create chaos to eclipse the hero killer. He smiled unpleasantly. Izuku asked what his role would be, sounding uninterested. He had grown weary of Tamura's attention-seeking outbursts but remained silent out of loyalty to their leader. Tamura assigned Izuku to handle Stain, instructing him to distract the vigilante or otherwise keep him away from the Nomu. Izuku agreed, thinking that he might be able to ask Stain some questions. Kurojiri opened a portal. Tamura and the Nomu went through first, and one of the Nomu carried Izuku while he examined its head. They emerged over the city of Hosu and moved to the rooftop of a building. The city looked unusually calm from that height. Izuku climbed down from the Nomu and noted that the largest Nomu's cranial structure seemed the most fragile of the three, though it should still withstand most direct impacts. He wondered where Stain would be and slipped into a nearby alley. Using his dark feathers, he propelled himself quickly between alleyways until he spotted movement. He found Stain about to engage the pro-hero native. An enormous explosion had just rocked the center of the city, and Stain muttered that the destruction had been wasted and that he would go after the youngster. Izuku emerged from the shadows and warned that Stain would not be able to reach his target. Native looked at Izuku and, alarmed, urged him to leave and insisted that the person was dangerous. Izuku cut him off sharply and identified Stain as the hero killer. Stain asked if the kid intended to try and kill him. Izuku replied that he did not kill people and that he would not allow anyone to be killed in front of his eyes. Stain reached for his sword and said he would ask for a name before doing anything. Izuku introduced himself as Crow and then, while producing a staff, asked Stain why he killed heroes. Stain answered that heroes and the society that supported them were rotten, that true heroes no longer existed except for one, and that motivations had become skewed by money, fame, and recognition. Izuku's low chuckle irritated Stain, who demanded to know what he found funny. Izuku suggested that Stain's violent path looked like the actions of someone radicalized by disappointment. Suddenly Izuku ducked instinctively to avoid someone rushing past him who slammed into Stain and forced him to stagger backward. Izuku recognized the newcomer by his costume as Tenya Ida and wondered what the student was doing there. Tenya announced himself as Ingenium in a determined voice, ignoring both Izuku and Native, but Stain struck back, and Tenya's helmet flew off, leaving him stunned and exposed. Stain dismissed him as another kid and demanded to know who he had claimed to be. Tenya swallowed and began to say that he was the brother of the hero Ingenium and that because of Stain, the sentence hung unfinished as the confrontation tightened. Tenya declared that Tensei would no longer be able to be a hero and stared into the villain's eyes with hatred, promising that he would avenge him. Stain reacted instantly and moved to strike a lethal blow, but Izuku was faster and kicked Tenya so hard that he tumbled several meters away. Izuku accused the student of being out of his mind and told him he had come here to fight a killer with years of experience and a record of attacking professional heroes, asking why he would think he could win. Tenya insisted that the villain was to blame and reminded them that Tensei would never walk again and could never be a hero, rising with anger. Izuku, identifying Tenya Ida as a young aspiring hero from Class 1A at the prestigious UA Academy, warned that vengeance felt more like a villain's impulse than a hero's, and asked Tenya seriously whether revenge suited him. Tenya remained silent and looked at the ground. Tenya admitted that he knew, but asked what he should do with the hatred he felt, on the verge of tears. Stain told Izuku to give up and drew his sword, accusing the boy of selfishly following a desire for revenge and abandoning his path as a hero, saying he did not deserve to live. Stain advanced slowly, but was forced to recoil when a knife thrown by Izuku nearly reached his foot. Izuku made it clear that no one would be killed there, drew two knives, and stepped between Stain and Tenya. He told Tenya that if he really wanted to be a hero he should not fall into arrogant instincts, that he surely had friends to lean on, and pointed toward Native as an example, saying Tenya needed to be able to help someone who needed it. Tenya was surprised by those words, but Stain interrupted, remarking that Izuku's morality was too good for a villain and even better than that of many heroes. Izuku replied wryly that, despite being seen as a villain in that moment, he harbored a certain heroic delusion, then moved into a combat stance. Without further words, Stain and Izuku launched at each other in a duel of two swords against two knives, a fast-paced, stylized clash that showcased their skill and training in fluid, anime-like choreography. Meanwhile, Tenya did not waste time. He decided to act to make up for his earlier recklessness, and as quickly as he could without his quirk he grabbed Native and tried to carry him out to safety. Stain noticed and hurled his sword toward Tenya. The blade flew dangerously close to Tenya's head. Izuku could not activate his quirk in time to intervene. Melissa's shield then appeared, moving with incredible speed. She kicked the sword aside to deflect it and landed in front of Tenya to shield him. Melissa wore a dark green suit with black trim and white gloves that reached past her elbows. A pale blue energy seemed to pulse from her, marking her arrival and pulling the moment into a brief, charged calm. Izuku sat quietly at the bar, sipping his coffee and watching the broken television. Kurogyari stood nearby polishing a glass, and Tamura paced, striking the screen with growing frustration. It had been less than a day since the incident in Hosu. Shigaraki had lost 2 basic nomus and a black nomu. One had been taken down by Stain, and the others had been overwhelmed by Endeavor's flames. Izuku had lingered in the alley after leaving, curious to see how the 3 young men would handle the killer. He had thought about intervening but trusted that none of them would die and assumed Stain would be engaged. While that played out, Endeavor had confronted 2 of the nomus a few blocks away and had forced them down with overwhelming fire, eventually pursuing the last one toward the area where the young men were dragging the killer into the street. There the remaining nomu had seized Melissa, and Stain had ended the nomu to rescue her. Stain then launched into a long speech about society and corrupt heroes that Izuku found only partly convincing. The speech had been recorded by a civilian and reverberated through the media, turning all the coverage toward the hero killer and drowning out other narratives. Izuku did not mind the attention itself, but it had overshadowed Shigaraki. Every mention of the League now tied them to Stain, and that made Shigaraki only angrier. Izuku wondered briefly whether creating a nomu was more difficult because suitable subjects were hard to find or because useful quirks were rare. Kurogyari removed the glass from the counter and explained that Sensei and Dr. Kyudai handled the process, and that both factors made nomu production difficult. Izuku considered asking all for one for a nomu to study the serums and quirk, but decided it would be better to wait. After recent events, such a request seemed unlikely to be granted. 1 month later, before noon, Izuku and Kurogyari had to stop Tamura from starting a fight. Jiren, who usually accompanied Shigaraki to meetings, had brought 2 villains who had volunteered to come in person. Their personalities clashed, and both had come because of Stain, which struck a raw nerve with Tamura. He expressed his agitation with a tense blend of anger and irritation, then launched himself at the 2 newcomers with the intent to kill. Kurogyari created multiple portals to intercept the incoming attacks and prevent serious harm, while Izuku used his shadows to coil around the 3 and hold them motionless. Izuku noticed with relief that his restraint worked as the 3 struggled in the tight weave of shadow. Kurogyari leaned close to Shigaraki and whispered something that calmed him, though Izuku could not make out the words. Once Shigaraki quieted, Izuku released them. Shigaraki walked past the others, muttering insults as he went. Kurogyari asked Izuku politely to follow and prevent any reckless actions. Izuku finished his coffee and agreed. He did not bother with a disguise. His appearance was already far from ordinary, and no one would easily recognize him. He followed Shigaraki into a nearby shopping mall. After becoming a villain and spending most of his time training, working, or hanging out at the bar, Izuku had developed a strange fondness for crowded outdoor-style spaces. He appreciated the light and the flow of people. Tracking Shigaraki in the mall was not difficult. From an upper floor, Izuku watched as Shigaraki approached Melissa from behind, took hold of her and guided her into a seat. The position and the inattentive crowd made it unlikely anyone would notice what was happening. For several minutes Shigaraki pressed Melissa to answer his questions about society and the reason Stain had been exalted. Shigaraki drew a connection between All Might, the heroes, society, and Stain, arguing that everything stemmed from them. Izuku observed from above and fashioned a small bird-shaped cluster of shadows. He sent it to hover beside Shigaraki so he could deliver a warning. Shigaraki addressed the bird angrily, beginning to say something violent before Izuku interrupted. Izuku briefly informed him that 5 UA students were a few meters away in the crowd and that 2 heroes on that floor would pass right where he stood. He urged Shigaraki to leave. The shadow bird dispersed into particles after delivering the message. Shigaraki made a frustrated sound and released Melissa, muttering as he walked away. The encounter ended with Shigaraki turning his back and leaving the area. He released her and headed toward the crowd. The albino slipped unnoticed through the people, while the blonde took a moment to breathe and reflect on the villain's words. Izuku moved toward an alley where he was sure Shigaraki would pass, and a minute after his arrival Shigaraki appeared. Shigaraki told him that he had never asked for help and brushed past him. Izuku followed and pointed out that he had needed help and that killing her or starting to kill civilians would have led to a disaster. Shigaraki dismissed the comment and claimed he would have found a way out. Izuku countered that it was not a risk worth taking over something so trivial, remembering what he had overheard in their conversation. After that exchange, Izuku trailed the albino in silence. They walked through several places for about an hour before returning to the bar. Izuku found it surprising that someone as notorious as Shigaraki could go unnoticed when dressed as described, but he reminded himself that people rarely pay attention to their surroundings. Back at the bar, the two new members were still there. Shigaraki ignored them and kept moving while Izuku took a seat at the counter. Kurojairi approached with a glass of water and asked if anything had happened. Izuku recalled meeting the blonde Melissa Shield saying he had threatened her for answers and had reached the same conclusion he always reached. Kurojairi completed the thought by noting that everything always came back to killing All Might, and both men fell into a thoughtful silence. Suddenly the blonde woman sat beside Izuku, resting her hand on her face and staring at him intently. Izuku asked if she needed something. She said she wanted to know who he was. Izuku tersely told her to call him Crow. She protested that she had used her real name already and complained about being the only one to introduce herself honestly. Dabi replied that she was the only one foolish enough to do so. She asked what was wrong with giving her real name, stood up and spun on her heels. Izuku observed that if her quirk allowed her to transform into others, it made sense that she would be unconcerned with using a real identity. She asked if he knew who she was. Izuku said he had assumed from her words and the introductions he had heard. She moved closer with a playful tilt and asked if he would let her take a sample of his blood, producing a small blade near him as she smiled. Izuku refused calmly. As she leveled her weapon, Izuku had a black book in his hand and his shadows undulated gently around her. She called him boring, put her weapon away, and relaxed her tone. Izuku let his quirk fade and sat back facing the counter. Only two new members, and he already felt that what lay ahead would be exhausting. Later, Izuku used his dark healing quirk to mend Melissa's injuries as she lay unconscious on the ground. They were in a heavily damaged area of a small mountain deep in the forest. Nearby, a dark-haired boy lay unconscious, and a tall blonde man rested among the rubble, battered and unresponsive. Once Izuku had healed Melissa enough for her injuries to stabilize, he glanced left and saw Dabi's blue flames consuming part of the forest in the distance. 2 days earlier, after almost a month of inactivity aside from a shopping mall incident, Shigaraki assigned a new mission to the League. During that time Izuku had focused on strengthening and refining his control over the shadows, emerging even more prepared than he had been against Stain. The arrival of Dabi and Toga had also led to organizational changes and the creation of a frontline action squad made up of current League members, excluding Kurojairi and Shigaraki, Dabi, Toga, Magna, Mr. Compress, Spinner, Muscular, Mustard, Moonfish, Twice, and a Nomu customized to obey Dabi. Dabi was named leader of that squad. Izuku was not officially part of the frontline team, but he would take part in the mission planned in 2 days. An attack on the first-year Hero Course camp. The camp would include Eraserhead, Vlad King, the Pussycats, and 40 students. The plan relied on the inability of the heroes to summon reinforcements, which simplified their approach, but Izuku had reservations. Shigaraki would not allow him to make any changes, and the assignment he had been given felt both the simplest and the vaguest of the tasks. The strategy was straightforward. Dabi would set portions of the forest alight, Twice would produce clones to assault the camp directly, Muscular would circle to attack from the rear, Toga's role was to collect blood samples from at least 5 people, and Mustard would separate groups with his smoke. The missions for Mr. Compress and Izuku were less strictly defined, and Izuku suspected there was information being withheld. He pushed the suspicion aside to focus on preparing properly. 1 hour before the operation, the 10 villains and the Nomu stood on a cliff at the edge of the forest. Dabi announced that, according to their information, The students would be conducting activities in the forest that day and that the team was ready. The villain stepped forward and told the others to proceed, reminding them that they all had a mission. The villains dispersed and moved according to plan, except Izuku, who waited for the fire to spread before showing himself. He felt uneasy, convinced someone was hiding something. Izuku thought it did not matter, and his cane reverted to its book form as he decided to entertain himself for a while. He opened the book. Glowing letters summoned black feathered wings identical to his dark feathers. This black wings ability allowed him to travel long distances faster than his other skill, although it was less useful for short, quick movements. He took to the air and used the smoke from the fire Dabi was creating as cover. He descended not far from the center and used his dark feathers to move through the forest until he encountered a pair of black-haired students. He recognized the girl as Momo Yaoyorozu from Class A. Using his feathers, he manifested behind them. Izuku greeted them and asked about the camp and whether they had made any significant progress in their abilities while he toyed with his cane. Yaoyorozu turned, startled, and asked who he was and whether he belonged to the League of Villains. Izuku identified himself as Crow, mentioned he thought he had seen her at the USJ, and bowed by turning his cane into a hat. He then tried to recall the other student's name and quirk, saying he believed it was Yosetsu Aways and that his ability had something to do with welding. Yosetsu asked Yaoyorozu what they should do, frightened but taking a fighting stance. Izuku assured them he would not harm them, then suggested that if they wanted to survive they should run, pointing behind them. He disappeared, and the two students turned to see a green Nomu with a saw for an arm appear several meters away. They began to run desperately. From above, Izuku resumed using his wings to survey the scene. He circled and watched as many students were occupied or in danger while Mustard's smoke worked to separate them. The smoke kept him from seeing what was happening inside the thicker areas, so he decided to move toward the center, where two of the pussycats were fighting Spinner and Magna. As he drew near, he froze at the sound of a massive attack somewhere on the small hill in the middle of the forest. He turned and observed the area through red contact lenses. Another impact echoed, then another. Izuku thought the assailant had to be muscular, irritated that such a violent fighter would be picking fights in the middle of their operation. The lack of commitment from people like Muscular or Toga annoyed him. While he did not worship All for One, he still performed his duties and expected others to do the same. His frustration faded when a gust of wind hit him. He had arrived just as the clash seemed to be ending. Muscular, transformed into a massive tangle of muscle fibers, seemed to have overwhelmed someone. Izuku was annoyed by that, but his attention shifted when he noticed a child attacking with water and Muscular moving toward him. He prepared to intervene, but help arrived on its own. Bright blue sparks suddenly flared beneath the mass of fibers and the strained shout of a girl was heard. Izuku watched as Melissa took down Muscular by herself. Impressed but mindful of his mission, Izuku vanished in a flurry of feathers and reappeared behind the child. He intended to get to work and rendered the child unconscious with his cane. Melissa recognized him and, turning to face him, demanded to know why they wanted to take Bakugo and why they were doing it now, speaking angrily and with effort. Izuku reacted with confusion and thought of Shigaraki, realizing that the wide dispersal of their assignments had been deliberate to keep him uninformed. The plan had been explained without revealing Compress's role. Izuku admitted to Melissa that he did not know what she was talking about, but he said he had work to do and believed his next actions would be a favor for her. His cane transformed into shadows that merged with his limbs, strengthening his arms and legs. He launched forward and struck the blonde, delivering a blow that rendered her unconscious. She lay disheveled on the ground, the struggle evident in her condition. Izuku noticed that her arms looked badly injured. He thought it did not matter, she would not wake for a while. He used dark healing to mend the blonde's arms and tore a strip from his coat to cover her. He left her unconscious for the next half hour after the blow, then moved on. Izuku thought angrily that he would have to speak with Shigaraki later as his book reappeared. He formed wings and flew toward the city center, considering how to complete his mission. They would capture Bakugo, but he also had to decide what to do about the albino. He knew the albino did not like him, He remembered how many times that man had complained to All for One about Izuku's patience and generosity. Now a line had been crossed. Izuku recalled who Katsuki Bakugo had been to him, and that made the albino's actions even harder to accept. Izuku reflected that Bakugo might lack the ethics and courage of a true hero, but he did not seek power so much as to emulate the image of the invincible hero All Might. No matter how wrong Bakugo's behavior, Izuku could not call him a villain. He vanished into a spray of feathers. The battle downtown had reached a stalemate. Heroes could not dislodge the villains and vice versa. In the middle of that chaos, feathers condensed into Izuku. He told the villains that it was time to end things and made a gesture at his wrist. He dissolved into feathers and reappeared in the forest, then began walking back to the agreed point. He paused when he saw Compress flying ahead, followed by a few others, and noticed that Mustard Smoke was gone and that he had not seen Moonfish since his first flight. Izuku thought that if they had been defeated, at least 2 psychopaths and 1 nuisance were gone. He activated his wings and hurried after Compress. Shoto Todoroki, Fumikage Tokoyami, and Mizo Shoji lagged behind on foot, so Izuku caught the villain in midair to move faster toward the rendezvous. Compress began to claim mission success until he realized Izuku already knew the truth. Izuku stated that he knew the real mission and that Compress did not need to try to hide it. Compress, with a cavalier smile, asked if Izuku had seen the others as they landed, and Izuku reported that Moonfish, Muscular, and Mustard had been defeated, while Spinner and Magna had been accounted for earlier. Compress remarked that 2 fewer psychopaths was at least something. Izuku gave no reply beyond a sideways smile as Dabi and Twice arrived, followed a moment later by Toga and then the Nomu. Dabi asked about the other 3 and, glancing at a device, decided it did not matter and activated a switch. Within half a minute, the pursuers who had been chasing Compress arrived too late as purple portals opened and everyone began to withdraw. Compress and Izuku bowed in a brief, formal gesture before leaving, the forest fading behind them and only the sound of distant flames consuming the trees remaining. They emerged through the portal into a bar where Shigaraki sat at the counter drinking. Izuku used shadow-like tendrils to restrain Shigaraki's arms and legs, pinning him against the wall, and gathered his shadow into a solid fist to deliver a hard strike to the stomach that left Shigaraki breathless. Izuku, still angry, stated that he did not know if Sensei had approved the mission but was certain Sensei had not proposed it. Shigaraki tried to speak through the pain but another quick strike silenced him again. Izuku expressed that he had always been grateful to have reached this place and grateful to the one who had found him, then released the shadows and let Shigaraki drop. He warned that the only thing keeping him from continuing to beat Shigaraki or from doing so every day until he matured was Sensei. With that, Izuku prepared to leave for his apartment to rest. Kurogiri asked what happened to the others after taking physical form. Izuku replied angrily that the 3 had been defeated. Kurogiri mused that it was a shame Muscular and Moonfish had been top-tier villains, but at least there were 2 fewer dangerous people. Izuku asked to be taken, and Kurogiri opened a portal to his apartment. Izuku passed through, leaving the bar in silence. Toga teased that she had not wanted to say anything, but that Izuku had clearly angered Tamura. Tamura told her to be quiet and called the kid spoiled as he rose and clutched his stomach, still recovering. Tamura clenched his fist in fury and demanded to know where Katsuki Bakugo was. Compress produced a small sky-blue orb that unfolded and revealed Bakugo unconscious. Tamura ordered that he be kept immobilized and gagged, saying he did not want to hear him scream when he woke, and he told Kurogiri to take him to the master. Meanwhile, Izuku had just arrived at his apartment. He hurled a knife into a wall in frustration, still angry with Shigaraki and tempted to keep striking him, but he knew doing so would anger All for One. More worrisome to him was the possibility that All for One could intrude back into his mind and learn of the distrust he felt. He decided it would be better to avoid going tomorrow and removed his suit. In the bathroom he examined himself in the mirror. The cheap gray dye would wash out with a shower, and he realized the haircut he had gotten months ago barely showed now that his messy green hair had grown out at the sides. He picked up a pair of scissors, wondered why not, and began trimming his hair. 2 days later, just before midnight in the city of Kamino, Izuku lay on his bed with his hair short in its natural state. He fashioned a knife shape with a shadow and toyed with it while staring at the wall. He had avoided returning to the bar since the mission. It had been nearly 2 days. His avoidance did not stem from fear of Bakugo or unease at his presence, but from what Bakugo represented of his past. Knowing Bakugo was there had brought on more dreams about Inko than usual, and that angered him. He could not avoid it any longer. All for One had told him to speak with him today. He told himself it was almost time, splashed his face with water, and tried to stay calm, reminding himself not to let Bakugo touch his head so Bakugo could not learn his thoughts. He leaned on the sink and breathed deeply until he heard Kurogiri announce his arrival. Kurogiri asked if he was ready. Izuku turned, grabbed a couple of knives, and went through the portal. At the bar, Kurogiri explained that he would fetch Shigaraki and that if the two had finished he would bring him over. Twice greeted him in his usual fractured tones, alternating between coaxing and mocking. Izuku thought he would not have problems with most of them and glanced at Katsuki, who sat silent and stared fixedly. Toga teased Dabi that Izuku had gone quiet and then playfully leaned against Izuku, commenting on his haircut. Izuku said he had cut it because he no longer liked the old style and went to the bar to pour a glass of water. He sat and watched a television interview with UA teachers who had been at the camp, trying to ignore Katsuki's gaze. About 10 minutes after Izuku arrived, Shigaraki stepped through a portal with a smug smile aimed at Izuku. Izuku's expression hardened, tempted to strike him, but he restrained himself and followed Shigaraki through the portal. The space he entered was different from usual. Multiple screens and tubes connected to All for One surrounded them, and the room felt broader and darker than before. Izuku knelt a few meters from the villain and asked what All for One wanted. All for One greeted him in a falsely cordial tone, noting it had been a long time since Izuku had visited and inquiring about his progress with his quirk and analyses. Izuku replied that he had been diligent, had made significant progress, and that he had not left the study of quirks in the past week but planned to resume fieldwork the next day. All for One praised Izuku's efficiency and dedication but reminded him of the real reason for the meeting. Izuku understood that it was to discuss the previous mission and his relationship with Shigaraki going forward. All for One confirmed this and explained that he had allowed Tamura's proposal because it was one of Tamura's first reasonable ideas. He wanted Izuku to see the positive side as well. Izuku, feeling frustrated, interrupted and said that the plan essentially asked him to remain silent about a terrible idea. All for One affirmed that impression and said that because Izuku had been a reliable executor, he wanted him to be even more useful to Tamura in the future. He ordered Izuku to improve his relationship with Shigaraki so that, in time, Shigaraki would trust him enough to serve as a voice of conscience. He asked if Izuku would comply. Izuku was silent, staring at the floor and clenching his teeth. All for One pressed him for an answer and demanded to know whether he would obey or had objections. Izuku thought that he had many objections, then raised his head and asked why All for One had allowed Tamura to do what he had done. Izuku spoke with clear irritation, insisting that the other person knew perfectly well not only who that man had been to him but also that he could never become a villain, because his pride was too great to be swayed. He argued that even if the proposal had seemed reasonable, it made no sense that he would abandon him, and yet he had. All for One interrupted with a severe tone, reminding Izuku who had helped him and given him a chance to change the world in exchange for helping them and remaining loyal. Izuku lowered his gaze and began to address his mentor, faltering as he tried to find the right words. All for One responded by saying he knew Tamura was nothing compared to him now, but that one day Tamura would be. He slammed his hand against the chair for emphasis. Izuku understood. He could feel the villain growing more convinced that the moment had come to control him by some quirk. He had known from the beginning that the only reason All for One had not done it sooner was to let him develop his own potential so the eventual use would be more effective. Izuku told his mentor that he was deeply grateful for everything, even if the mentor's intentions had been to use him from the start, because, despite that, he had been the only one to see his value and potential. His voice relaxed and his expression softened, though he kept his eyes down. All for One said he appreciated Izuku's understanding and admitted he had also grown fond of him, but that it was time to sleep. He stood and moved closer. At that moment the building shook violently, A cloud of dust billowed and rubble scattered around them in an explosive, anime-style disturbance. The commotion had been caused by the hero MT lady destroying the entrance on the other side of the building and the heroes immobilizing the nomis in that gallery, though the heroes did not see them. Izuku looked toward All for One, who now stood at his side staring intently toward the opposite end of the hall. Izuku started to ask whether they were going to retreat, but he saw the villain begin to advance slowly toward the heroes, clapping as he moved. Izuku knew the man was unimaginably powerful as he looked over the ruined block, most of it reduced to dust and rubble. The scale of the destruction made Izuku think that this was absurdly overwhelming as he watched All for One. All for One stood at one edge of the scene, at the warehouse entrance, while the entire block ahead lay as the protagonist now saw a desolate wasteland created by an explosion that had sent buildings and heroes flying. All for One extended his hand and praised the combination of quirks he had used: air cannon, springy limbs, quadruple kinetic impulse and quadruple strength. He described it as delightful. Izuku thought about the centuries-old villain with an arsenal of perfectly combined powers, a lifetime of experience, and an intelligence that, together with his deep understanding of people, made him perhaps the greatest manipulator Izuku had ever seen. He looked up at the 2-meter-tall figure and recognized that this was All for One. All for One opened his palm and a gray, mud-like mass formed there. In seconds, every member of the League of Villains appeared, along with Katsuki Bakugo, all coughing from the strange sludge. Tamura called out to his teacher. All for One told Tamura that he had failed again, but offered comfort with a hand extended and encouragement to rise and try again as many times as necessary, insisting it was all for him. As the others recovered, the green-haired boy Izuku watched All for One carefully. He allowed himself a satisfied smile as a realization settled in: Shigaraki was not an heir. Why would he be? A centuries-old villain whose only problem was his body needed a vessel. All for One would manipulate and let that vessel grow, not like Izuku, but by feeding and developing its potential through hatred until it was so blinded by that hate that it could be controlled. Then All for One would grant power and take control of the young, already powerful host to reclaim his former glory, Izuku concluded. He could not linger on that thought because All Might suddenly arrived, flying at full speed. All for One met him in a clash of force and words. Izuku watched in amazement, using his shadows to anchor himself and avoid being hurled by the shockwaves. From his vantage point, Izuku could not hear everything because of the distance, but he saw Kurojairi and Dabi unconscious while others were regrouping, including Katsuki. He was tempted to remove Katsuki by force to avoid being around him, but that would be too conspicuous. All for One ordered Tamura to take Katsuki Bakugo and go, and then used black, claw-like constructs to strike Kurojairi, forcing quirks to activate. A portal created by Kurojairi opened, and a group of Class A students appeared, launching over the area on a giant ice ramp. Izuku expected All for One to attack them, but All for One was instead sent flying into a building by an all-might punch, allowing Katsuki to reach the students and leave using his explosions. Izuku considered the next problem as he watched the young heroes flying away. It was a crossroads. More heroes would arrive soon, and victory for All for One was not guaranteed. Even if All for One won, joining the League or staying with him would be dangerous, because if the villain fell and Shigaraki became leader, he would be controlled. Izuku did not want that. He wanted to be free. On the battlefield, most League members were being defeated by Gran Torino, but Izuku avoided that fate by instinctively activating his quirk, creating a wall of darkness that pushed the veteran hero away. Izuku thought that everyone here might lose. He felt a pang of regret for some of them. He had begun to like a few. He looked at Kurojairi with a soft expression, then accepted the necessity of his decision, formed his black wings, and rose several meters into the air. He manifested his book and used Crimson Flower to shield himself from a column of fire coming from the side. He turned to see Endeavor, who had launched the attack from nearly a block away. Mirko arrived in the air intent on a kick, but Izuku managed to evade her. Mirko shouted at him, demanding that he not dodge and that he fight her. Izuku declined and turned toward All for One. From above, he expressed gratitude to his teacher for seeing his true worth and announced that it was time to say goodbye. All for One looked at him and then took a blow from All Might. Then Izuku flew away at full speed, distancing himself from the battlefield and the hero's attention. The heroes prioritized stopping All for One rather than pursuing him. Izuku headed to the apartment he had been given, approaching through a nearby alley where police and detectives were already examining the perimeter. Using his dark feathers to remain unseen, he entered the assigned apartment. In his haste, he was careless and came through a window, materializing in the living room without noticing anything. At that moment, someone nearby shouted for them to catch him. He heard footsteps a few meters away. Instantly, he activated his quirk, reinforcing his limbs with the dark energy he drew from the book. He spun and delivered a powerful strike that sent one officer staggering backward, his helmet cracking from the impact. His room was being searched, but he had not noticed because he had not seen anyone inside and did not realize the door was open or that someone stood outside with a notebook. A man on a radio announced that Izuku Midoriya had been located, but his report was cut off. Realizing there was no time to waste, Izuku launched himself with his enhanced limbs and moved through 5 officers with precise, non-lethal blows that left them dazed and sprawled but not unconscious. He did not linger. He thought that he would have liked to take their weapons, but he did not want to end up in prison. He checked his quirk notebooks, grabbed a couple of knives, a coat, and a small wad of bills from a drawer, then jumped from the window. Using his dark feathers, he dispersed into a flurry of black plumage and slipped away without being seen. 2 hours later, he sat hidden in an empty building and watched one of the giant street TVs. Since he had left the battlefield only minutes earlier, he had heard the distant uproar of the crowd chanting All Might's name as the heroes finished the fight. From his vantage point, he watched people begin to disperse and rescue teams move into the block where the battle had taken place while patrols escorted the captured villains away. He decided to stay put for the moment, glancing at a nearby security camera and telling himself it would be hours before anyone reviewed the footage. He sighed, thinking that everything had escalated far too quickly. Less than 3 hours earlier, he had almost been subdued by a quirk designed to turn him into a puppet, and now he found himself in an administrative building with no home, scarce resources, and no organization to provide for him. He could not pretend nothing had happened and try to go back to being Izuku Midoriya now that his identity was known. He could not remain in the League, it had been dismantled. Joining another criminal group or trying to be independent held little appeal. He had been part of the League because they had offered him a hand when no one else had. He thought he would postpone big decisions until later. Dawn was coming, and as the last fragment of what had been the League, the authorities would likely prioritize finding him. He transformed into feathers and slipped through a ventilation to the roof, materialized for a moment to look at the night, then leapt and reformed into plumage to glide into an alley. He put on his coat, blended into the flow of people, and walked toward the busier streets, aiming for a safer area. A few days later, after dodging attempts at robbery, he rifled the pockets of a pair of thugs who had tried to mug him, pocketing a little money and taking the shoes off one of them. He remarked to himself that this could not continue and that he needed to decide soon or Kamino would become an increasingly small trap for him. He made his way through alleys to a half-ruined building in a vacant lot on the edge of the city, the place he had stayed since the League raid. Since the raid, he had been living off small thefts, changing clothes, gathering coin, hoping to scrape together enough to bribe a policeman who might smuggle him out of the city. Despite everything, he had spent the last week thinking more clearly about his future than he ever had since joining the League. He realized he had no idea what he truly wanted. He wondered what Amber would do, his teacher who had always been a reference for quick decisions and life choices. He reminded himself that she was a professional killer and that he had never been willing to take a life. Lying back on a piece of cardboard, he asked himself what he could possibly do next. A voice spoke from the shadows and asked if leaving right now would be preferable. He rose instantly, the book forming in his hand as shadows curled around him. The stranger said calmly that he was not an enemy unless Izuku chose to make him one. Izuku thought it was just another villain using charm and struggled to keep his guard up as he asked who the man was and what he wanted. The stranger said he had heard about the young man who had joined the League of Villains, first through news mentions and later on television during the Kamino fight. He added that he had come to recognize him for the quirk analyses he kept, and he tossed a few of those notebooks forward. Izuku immediately identified the man as Kai Chizaki and wondered how the leader of the Shai Hasaikai had come into possession of his work. Chizaki replied that everything had a price. Chizaki responded that it had not been easy, especially because there had been too many, but he had seen Izuku's capacity for analysis and appreciated it a great deal. Izuku replied that Chizaki still had not said what he specifically wanted from him. Chizaki extended a hand and offered Izuku a place in his organization, explaining that he needed capable pieces for his plans and that Izuku could contribute a great deal. He pointed out that Izuku had been found days earlier and had not left because he did not know what to do. He could not flee, since he was wanted by the police and now known to the world, so he could not wander free as a petty thief forever. Izuku accepted, though he interrupted to say that acceptance was complicated. He had nowhere to live and could not be at ease, so he wanted to know what the organization offered. Chizaki explained that he personally intended to return the Hasaikai to its former glory. He outlined a plan to monopolize both the hero and villain markets and to gain the power to shake the foundations of the current society. He pointed at the green-haired young man and asked whether Izuku was not another victim of the hero and villain world, a society obsessed with quirks. Izuku fell silent and stared. Chizaki's yellow eyes burned like twin orbs, ready to set the world aflame to get what they desired. The man could be a psychopath, but he had not been lying. Izuku accepted again, transforming his book into a hat and bowing. He asked to be called Crow. Chizaki expressed hope that they would work well together. 2 weeks later, Crow walked through brightly lit underground corridors with a serious expression, striding confidently and ignoring the Yakuza who passed him. He stopped at a double door, knocked twice, and waited until a young white-haired man in a long white coat opened it. Crow greeted him as Chronostasis. Chronostasis, mildly annoyed, insisted he preferred to be called Chrono. Crow replied that Chronostasis was the name he had been given and that he would continue to use it, then asked where the bullets were as he stepped inside. Chronostasis closed the door and produced boxes, explaining that they held temporary and permanent bullets and enhancing serums. He pointed to a compartment in a cabinet where antidotes for permanent and temporary erasure were stored. Crow realized that Chizaki wanted him to optimize these for mass production. Chronostasis handed him one antidote and a temporary erasure bullet for study and warned him not to waste resources. Crow prepared his tools and gloves to begin the analysis, thinking through previous ideas. He waited until Chrono left before settling in. He reflected that another criminal organization and its second-in-command disliked him while their boss held him in high esteem. It felt like nothing new. He spent the day examining the bullets and their operational process. It was fascinating work, at least until, when opening a permanent bullet, he found biological traces that made him stop. Chizaki's earlier words came back to him. These had been developed from a subject with a quirk that allowed that transformation. He now understood that the material had come from a human source, and he had never imagined it would be literally created that way. Crow felt nausea and struggled to breathe. The thought of who the subject had been, the method used to obtain the material, and the suffering the person must have endured during experiments and execution filled him with dread. He thought that while Shigaraki could be cruel, turning a person into raw material for weapons crossed a line beyond ethics. That conflict resurfaced the reason he had been reflecting weeks earlier. He had too much of a moral sense to be an ordinary villain, yet he was too bitter and hurt by society to want to be a hero. He could not live normally given everything he had done. It felt like a dead end. He wanted to take his things and run, but both the logistics and the knowledge he now held made escape impossible. His life, his ethics, and his reasoning kept leaving him with a bitter taste for simply existing. He picked up a scalpel for a moment, a dangerous thought flashing through him, but the book materialized at his side and shadows rose to cover parts of his skin. He lowered the instrument, acknowledging that while the urge remained, there was something or someone that kept him from acting on it. He remembered the last time he had contemplated ending his life, reaching a limit and trying to end his misery. Now it felt different. He toyed with shadows in his hands, stared at the ceiling for several minutes, and thought that he never really fit anywhere, as if he were not made to belong to the schemes of this world. He dismissed the worry for later. After that crisis, he carefully packed up his study materials and placed his notes in a notebook. He left the lab with a steady pace, walked to the end of the corridor, took a deep breath to calm himself, and knocked on the door calmly. Shizaki called his chosen name, Crow. Chrono opened the door, gestured for him to enter, and told Izuku that Chrono had informed him Izuku was studying the antidote and the bullet. Izuku confirmed that the mechanism worked as described and that he had several ideas for mass-producing both, and he reviewed his notes while doing so. Shizaki replied that the sooner the better, sat at a desk, and asked what they were waiting for. Izuku explained that he needed to examine the subject, perform some tests, take a blood sample, and obtain a portion of genetic material that was neither flesh nor blood. Shizaki closed his eyes, sighed, and agreed to take him to the subject the next day so he could do what was necessary. Izuku bowed slightly and left the room. He paused outside, breathed in fatigue, and thought that pretending was exhausting. He reminded himself that he only had to maintain his image and that the subject was not all for one, so there was no need to worry about mind-reading through contact. He walked briskly to the room assigned as his dormitory and collapsed onto the bed, exhausted. Izuku considered himself capable of empathizing with others or at least being objective enough to see when an idea was not as unreasonable as it appeared. Because of that, he understood precisely how far Shizaki could go. Shizaki had asked the older Yakuza in the organization about the man who had saved him and acted as a father figure, and his motivation was to repay that debt. Shizaki embodied the idea that the end justified the means, an ideology Izuku had sometimes defended depending on the goal. But after meeting Eri, Izuku had lost every argument in favor of that principle. A few days earlier, Shizaki had opened a door and explained that the girl was the old man's granddaughter, that her parents had died years ago, and that he had taken responsibility for her. He introduced her as Eri. When the door opened, Izuku saw a small girl of about 7 years old with white hair and red eyes who looked frightened, especially of Shizaki, who entered first. Shizaki greeted Eri with a voice that carried an unsettling edge, announced that the newcomer was Crow and that he would be staying for a while, and threatened Eri to behave or face consequences. Then he left the room, leaving Izuku alone with the girl. Izuku noticed a single camera in the room and used his shadows to cover it. He kneeled before the child and told her that he only needed a strand of her hair and a blood sample. He hoped that with those he might prevent Overhaul from hurting her further. The girl asked nervously what he intended to do, and Izuku reassured her that he would only take the samples and that it would not hurt. Confronted by the fear in her red eyes, Izuku hugged her. At first she did not know how to respond, but after a few seconds she relaxed and allowed the warmth of the embrace. Izuku reflected that in life there was always someone more miserable than oneself, and that for someone to be more miserable than a child her age was difficult to imagine. After about a minute he gently broke the hug and stood up. Eri hesitated, and Izuku told her to be still while he prepared his kit. He explained that he needed a hair strand and a blood sample to understand Eri's condition and to help stop her suffering. When she asked why he was being kind, Izuku answered that he could tell right from wrong and wanted to help her avoid more pain. He worked methodically, removing the shadows from the camera only after storing the hair and blood in different containers. Overhaul arrived accompanied by Chrono. Shizaki remarked that Izuku had finished quickly and asked if he needed anything else. Izuku requested a brief explanation of Eri's abilities to better understand how the bullets functioned and said that was all he needed. He closed his case and left the room without looking back at Eri. Back in the present, Izuku lay on a bed and stared at the combat suit that had been provided for him. His previous suit had become a mere memory he no longer missed, so he had no complaints. He murmured that if only the situation did not involve an innocent life, things would be simpler. The thought of Eri being used to achieve Chizaki's goals removed any justification he might have had for supporting those ends. Options crossed his mind: leak information to the heroes, defeat Shizaki and hand over the organization, or take Eri and run. The door opened abruptly. Chrono entered visibly agitated and stared intently at Izuku. Izuku asked what had happened. Chrono hesitated and then said there was nothing. Shizaki sighed as he closed the door and told Izuku that Eri, the girl used to produce the bullets, had escaped. The green-haired youth had been at the place for several weeks. Although Chizaki claimed to trust his abilities, Izuku knew that Chizaki's right-hand man, Chrono, did not trust him, so it was no surprise that Chrono had come to see whether Izuku had anything to do with the girl's escape. Izuku thought that coming here might not have been such a good idea and let himself fall back onto his bed. He stared at the ceiling, reflecting on everything that had happened before the League, how he had ended up here, and what options he still had to save Eri. He knew that his method to produce more anti-quirk bullets had worked, but Chizaki seemed unwilling to wait and would likely continue using the girl unless Izuku produced results quickly. He felt guilty about the fact that what he had done a few days ago could help prevent that. Suddenly Izuku shouted and sprang to his feet, frustrated with how his mind never stopped racing. His analytical ability, which had once brought him into contact with AFO, was both a blessing and a curse. He could not switch it off and often overthought even the simplest things. He forced himself to focus and began preparing some equipment. Fear was normal in life, especially of the unknown, but when someone had been hurt repeatedly it was natural to be afraid of anything that resembled that harm. That explained why Eri still feared Izuku, even after she had seen he meant no harm. Being around him left her uneasy much of the time. Izuku understood this completely. He treated her like a frightened animal that had been mistreated and would not stop doing his duty both because he was ordered to and because he believed she was safer with him than with anyone else. He took her everywhere, whether to the laboratory or out to fetch something, and when he could not watch her personally he monitored her with a small bird-like device created by his quirk. To anyone observing he looked more like a guardian than a jailer, and Chizaki was pleased by that, confident that escape had become impossible. One quiet evening, Eri addressed him timidly, calling him Crow. It was the first time in nearly 2 weeks that she had spoken first. Izuku stopped assembling a bullet and listened. She asked how old he was. He thought for a moment and reflected that he had recently turned 16. Eri explained that the girl she had seen the other day had seemed to be about his age but had looked like a hero. Izuku interpreted that she must be referring to when Eri had encountered Melissa and Togata. They were likely similar in age, but each had arrived at their current circumstances through different paths. He returned to assembling the next round, working with pliers, pressing each one into a press to finish it, and placing them into a case. There were 29 identical rounds already in the case. He thought that only one more would be needed to present the results bullets intended to neutralize a quirk's effect entirely. He set up the last one when a tremendous crash echoed from the entrance. Izuku told Eri to stay put, left the small monitoring bird with her, and rushed out. A subordinate of Chizaki barked orders for everyone to move to the entrance. People ran toward the entryway. Rappa, racing past, announced with excitement that heroes and police were arriving and that it was a raid on the Shai Hasaikai. He added that there was bound to be some hero to test his strength in a fierce fight. Rappa had a reputation for enjoying reckless violence and often acted with disloyal eagerness. As the commotion swelled, Izuku realized this was the moment he had been preparing for and what he had been thinking about for weeks. Instead of going to the entrance, he turned back toward the laboratory and looked intently at the white-haired girl. He extended his hand to Eri and told her that if she wanted to be free and never suffer again, she should take it. She looked confused and did not respond. He urged her that there was no time and asked once more whether she would come with him. A voice shouted, demanding that she come to her senses. The green-haired man only managed to run, grab the girl's hand, and lift her into his arms. He carried her into the corridor, forming his black wings and flying at full speed down the narrow passage. The narrowness made it dangerous, but he assumed no one would be in his path if everyone was still at the entrance. He wore a faint smile. He understood there was only one known exit and it was being attacked. He suspected Chizaki might have a hidden way out, but that did not concern him. He knew how to improvise his own. While flying, he slowed briefly when he passed the door to his room and felt tempted to stop to collect his notes and some clothes. Seeing the girl in his arms made it clear that was not possible, so he regained speed until he reached a much wider space, both in width and height. Izuku told Eri to hold on tightly and to cover her eyes as he stopped in midair. He studied the concrete slab above them and the few pipes that connected the street and the base. After searching for the weakest point, he positioned himself beneath it, standing still and beginning to concentrate. Izuku thought about the theory behind the crimson flower technique. His energy condensed into a wall, the condensation giving it that distinctive color. If he repeated the process but released the energy instead of shaping it into a wall, then he could use it as an attack. He manifested the book in his hand and opened it while aiming at the ceiling. The book vanished and dark energy began to gather in his palm, forming an unstable sphere that slowly took on a crimson hue. He prepared to launch the attack, lamenting inwardly that there was no time to think of a name for it, and then released the sphere at the roof. A powerful blast punched through the ceiling, opening a large hole and sending smoke and rubble into the air in an explosive display that cleared a path upward. From a distance, Chizaki shouted that it had been him. Izuku apologized to Chizaki, insisting that this had not been part of his plan. He added that with the heroes now arriving for Chizaki, there was no better moment to take Eri away. He then flew upward through the hole. They emerged into daylight, and from above he could see the whole block. The entrance to the hideout was already secured by the police and emergency teams, so he decided to leave quickly to avoid further complications. He flew low to a nearby alley, set Eri down on the ground, and created 2 small birds of darkness to scout the surrounding alleys and streets. He turned and saw the girl looking unsure, eyes darting in all directions as if she did not know whether to run or to return. Izuku thought that she did not know what to do, and privately admitted that he himself was not entirely sure. He reassured her that there was no longer any danger, that she would never have to return and would never have to see Chizaki again. Eri asked, both hopeful and uncertain, what she would do now. Izuku began to answer that they would first look for supplies, then realized that the plan he had in mind was not suitable for such a small child. Foraging through trash for clothes and useful items, stealing money, food, weapons, or clothing from underworld thugs, living in abandoned places and sleeping on garbage bags or cardboard, it made no sense to rescue her from a life of suffering only to hand her another existence of hardship. He thought that he could not guarantee food, clothing, a bed, a stable place to stay, or any education. He sighed and reminded himself that others could provide those things. He focused on one of his birds, which was scouting the area from the house where the heroes had been. The heroes had already defeated Chizaki, there were only a few injured people and the police were beginning to process the scene. Izuku told Eri that she would not have to do anything further. He exhaled and said that he had found a place where she would no longer suffer and where she could have the best things the world could offer. He knelt in front of her. She looked at him with confusion. He gave her a small, comforting hug and created 2 more small birds of darkness, placing one on her shoulder and sending the other to hover about 2 meters above her. Izuku ordered her to go, explaining that the bird above would guide her and the one on her shoulder would allow him to speak to her if necessary. He stepped back and pointed toward the exit of the alley. Eri asked, worried about what would happen to him. Izuku replied that nothing would happen, and that he believed it was better for her to go with those who could take care of her rather than come with him. He added that his name was Izuku and that she did not need to remember his alias, Crow, but that it was good for her to know his real name. He turned into another alley and disappeared from sight. Confused and a little frightened, the girl tried to follow but saw nothing when she turned the corner. He had told her to go and had promised that nothing bad would happen. She paused, looked at the bird on her shoulder, and agreed that she would go. Melissa murmured with slight embarrassment, then began to walk in the direction Izuku had indicated, following the dark bird that flew a little ahead of her. Minutes earlier, the raid had been both a success and a defeat. Overhaul had been arrested and the entire Shai Hasaikai organization dismantled, but the girl whose rescue had motivated the operation, Eri, was nowhere to be found. Investigators considered the possibility that the Yakuza had killed her, but there was no evidence, and in his stunned state Overhaul kept repeating that he had taken her. Night Eye and the police were coordinating the search and the investigation of the site. Outside, Nijire, Mirio, Uraraka, Tsuyu and Melissa sat in the back of an ambulance, resting and talking about everything that had happened. Melissa felt something land on her shoulder. It was a bird formed of shadow, but it vanished before she could say anything. From the direction it had come, she spotted another bird perched on a car a few meters away. Melissa told the others that she would be right back and walked slowly toward the car. The bird there disappeared, and she saw another farther off, so she followed the trail of dark birds until she reached the corner. There she watched the last one vanish and then saw Eri walking toward her direction. A voice carried on the wind told her to make sure the girl would be well cared for. Melissa turned and noticed a small bird had landed on her shoulder. It disappeared as she looked. Eri ran the last few meters and threw herself into Melissa's arms, and Melissa hugged her as the bird that had accompanied the child dissolved. On the rooftop of a small building in the area, Izuku lay back on the roof and watched the evening sky. He told himself that with that, this was concluded after making his last bird disappear. Closing his eyes, he felt tired after everything that had occurred and reflected on how the quirk that had brought so much trouble into his life before. Joining the League had become versatile. Combined with his intelligence and combat skills, it made him highly capable. He then muttered that he needed to figure out what to use now, stood up with a jump, put on a mask, looked at the sky for a few more seconds and then dematerialized into the dark feathers. In an alley in Jakku, a group of high school students were harassing a middle school boy whose appearance drew attention. There were sharp, spiky protrusions along parts of his body, especially his face. One of the bullies taunted whether he was even human and grabbed one of the protrusions that jutted from his cheek. The others laughed as they shook him around, but the sound of approaching footsteps made them release the boy and turn. A figure about 1.70 meters tall stood in the alley, dressed in tattered pants and shoes and wrapped in a dark coat that hid most of his features. One of the bullies demanded to know what he wanted, but the newcomer kept walking in silence. The bully urged him to answer and shoved a finger toward him, revealing a nail poised for attack. The stranger, his voice irritated, said that he wished adolescents would stop being so absurdly stupid. As his presence lengthened and became more imposing, he seemed to tower over them, and one of the bullies fired a nail from his finger. The projectile was absorbed by the stranger's clothes and had no effect. Panic set in and the attackers fired again, but their efforts were useless. The man moved with swift, practiced motions and neutralized them in seconds, tossing them to the ground without causing lasting harm. He then knelt and helped the bullied boy to his feet, telling him that he did not know him or his story and that it did not matter, but that no one should bother him, especially not over something as trivial as his appearance or his quirk. The boy thanked him with visible relief. The stranger released him, stepped over the sprawled teens without much concern, and began to walk away. The helped boy asked for his name. The stranger started to answer, beginning with I. Crow introduced himself as Crow before dissolving into black feathers. The young man watched those feathers carried by the wind with admiration, then withdrew, touching the marks from the blows and thinking about that stranger. Elsewhere, on the rooftop of the tallest building in the city, feathers gathered and coalesced until they formed a figure. Dark vapors rose from the newcomer but vanished with the breeze as he lowered his hood to reveal Izuku, who looked at the sky with a neutral expression and let himself fall to the rooftop to rest for a moment. Izuku thought that 7 months had passed since then, sighing as he watched the clouds. Since he had freed and delivered Eri, almost 8 months had passed, the day he left that city and went to Hosu. For the following weeks he survived by stealing while he tried to decide what to do with his life. Then he found his purpose. While watching heroes fight a giant villain in the streets, he also noticed a crime occurring in a nearby alley where no hero arrived. That sight showed him what he should do. He would live as a hero, not one accepted by the system but one the people needed, because the light of heroes like All Might only reached visible places. That day marked his first step. He intervened to help, appearing beside the attacker and stopping him with enough control to avoid killing, maintaining his policy of never taking a life. From then on he lived in the alleys, confronting criminals and stopping bullies who preyed on others. The police labeled him a vigilante and paid him little attention at first, but he became increasingly known for his constant presence, unlike other vigilantes who were more discreet and appeared only briefly. Because of this, he had to keep moving from city to city, from Hosu to Tokyo, back to Kamino, and almost a month ago he arrived in Jakku, where he continued the same work. His new lifestyle had taken a toll on his appearance. He had become paler with dark circles under his eyes, his hair was relatively long and unkempt, and he was noticeably thinner. Still, none of this affected his strength or skills. His knife and hand-to-hand combat techniques remained sharp, and he had come to understand his quirk more deeply. Suddenly his stomach growled. He realized he had not found food in the early hours and rose to his feet. He thought that by this hour there might be discarded food in the restaurant dumpsters, pulled his hood up, and walked to the edge of the rooftop. He paused to look over the city. Everything seemed so ordinary and noticeably calmer than a few months before. Criminal activity had dropped drastically because of recent events. After the fall of Shai Hasaikai, several criminal organizations fell as well, from mafias to groups akin to the League of Villains. The fall of Dr. Daruma Ujiko, creator of the Nomu and longtime associate of All for One, also weakened the underworld. The biggest blow had come in Daika 2 months earlier, when heroes dismantled the Liberation Army led by Redestro, demonstrating the heroes' capabilities and contributing to the nationwide decline in crime. Most major criminal networks in Japan had fallen or were close to collapse, and crime had continued to decrease, with Endeavor proving himself as the #1 hero and aspiring heroes from every academy participating actively in operations. These developments did not move Izuku much. Having once been part of a criminal organization, he had seen that villains were not always simply evil, and his goals were no longer about fighting those groups. What still bothered him, however, was a deeper issue that had driven him toward villainy in the first place: the way society treated quirks, a system shaped by the heroes themselves. He thought he needed something that could help change things on a larger scale, because no matter how much he traveled from city to city trying to fix things, he was only human. He found some pieces of discarded chicken and meat, took them, and ate while mulling over how inadequate he felt for his mission. As he reached the corner of an alley, he saw one of the many statues erected in honor of All Might after his retirement. He still felt anger toward that hero for what he represented, the one pillar who had pushed him, but over time he had come to understand that not everything was the hero's fault. However, Izuku's thoughts about All Might were different. He now realized that perhaps he, a mere human, could no longer do much to change the world on his own, but that All Might, the greatest hero of all time, might be able to do something about it. Izuku wondered how he could reach All Might and what he should do to convince him, while he rested in a dark alley watching 2 drunks fighting with bottles. The men were not paying attention to him. He watched as the fight escalated and used his shadows to separate them. He approached as they hurled insults and quickly subdued them, leaving them unconscious. He then stood silently in the alley, sighed, stretched, and dematerialized into his dark feathers, searching for the criminals and bullies who hid in the shadows of Jaku's heroes and authorities. 2 weeks later, the last remnant of the League of Villains was Izuku Midoriya. He had become less wanted in recent months thanks to operations and proactive measures to reduce crime, but once those efforts eased, his name resurfaced, especially after the alias he had once used as a villain became associated with an increasingly well-known vigilante. He had not disappeared after his first appearance and moved from city to city. Unlike many other vigilantes, he had a reputation for confronting teenagers. Those teenagers often maintained their innocence, but some were later connected to cases of abuse involving other youths. For seasoned heroes like Best Jeanist and Endeavor, this was not a major concern. They recognized the complex contributions vigilantes sometimes made. For the new generation of idealistic heroes seeking high-profile accomplishments, however, it mattered. When he vanished from Jaku and his presence was confirmed in Kyoto a week earlier, many rookie heroes and even some veterans sought him out, eager to be the ones who captured that famous vigilante and the last member of what had been the controversial League of Villains. All of this only irritated Izuku. The attention not only hindered his actions and threatened his mission, it also made him increasingly feel that Stain had a point in his rhetoric, at least to some extent. Izuku observed that his shadow constructs were weaker than the real thing, as an ordinary rat easily overpowered one of his shadow creations. He was sitting in a dumpster, waiting for nearby heroes to leave. He wanted to defeat them and go, but doing so would only draw more attention, which would complicate everything and turn his motives into topics for television and news programs. Izuku reminded himself that he had not heard the heroes in a while, so they must have moved on. Seeing no one, he grabbed a bag with a few possessions and climbed out of the dumpster, leaving the rat behind. He scanned the surroundings. Only dark, scratched walls met his gaze and began walking toward a junction of alleys. Izuku decided he should find a construction site and see if its sewer system was accessible. He needed a shower. He murmured into the air while smelling the clothes he had stolen the previous week. A voice a few meters behind him remarked that he should be careful, since someone might smell him from there. The young man turned calmly and saw a man standing with his hands in his pockets, wearing a detective-style suit. The man removed his hat and introduced himself as Naomasa Tsukachi. Naomasa Tsukachi had built a reputation over years on the force through dedication and effort. He had taken on cases that were often more than he should have handled, proving time and again that nothing was impossible for him until the disappearance of a teenager named Izuku Midoriya. Izuku had been declared missing after a fire destroyed his home and no trace of a body was found. Police investigations revealed that he had not attended his high school in the days before the fire, suggesting his disappearance may have occurred earlier. Naomasa took the case a week after the incident. At first he suspected kidnapping and that the arson had been used to cover something up, but no evidence supported that theory. After nearly a year with no breakthrough, the attack on UA by a group of villains had forced him to shift priorities, and the case went cold. The investigation into the League of Villains, however, eventually brought him back to Izuku. Witness statements from people near a bar described several youths seen coming and going from a building. Among those descriptions, one detail repeated itself and stuck in Naomasa's memory: messy green hair, about 1.70 meters tall, freckles visible up close, and green eyes. The description matched Izuku almost exactly. This also shed light on why the villain known as Crow had targeted Bakugo at the USJ. Interviews with former classmates had revealed the rougher dynamic Bakugo had with Izuku. When the League's raid occurred, a single member managed to escape, disappearing for more than a month until Kai Chisaki mentioned him during interrogation after the organization's fall. The trail went cold again until the name Crow began circulating among vigilantes with confirmed aliases. From that point Naomasa followed the green-haired man city to city, always arriving after he had left until now. Izuku tried to deny his identity, but he conceded that the investigation likely corroborated it and acknowledged Naomasa's methodical approach. Naomasa confirmed that he had discovered Izuku's identity even before the League was dismantled. Izuku then asked what the detective wanted and created a small bird-shaped shadow construct to watch for anyone nearby. Naomasa admitted that he had taken Izuku's disappearance case over a year ago and had not known what he would do once he found him. Izuku asked if the detective had been investigating him since that time. Naomasa replied that he had, and that he also knew what had happened with Katsuki Bakugo, though many details had only come to light after the raid. Izuku interrupted, stating flatly that he did not care whether Bakugo had been harmed or whether he had changed. Despite lingering resentment, it no longer mattered to him. Naomasa then asked what Izuku was doing now. Izuku answered that he was trying to be the kind of hero many needed, though he was not so egotistical as to believe he could change the world. His shadow bird vanished, and he thought to himself that he was indeed alone. Naomasa doubted that ordinary people could change the world through small acts, but acknowledged that at least they tried. Izuku inquired about Naomasa's relationship with All Might. Naomasa said it was quite close. Izuku requested that Naomasa bring All Might to the same spot in 2 days at the same time. He stated that if the meeting proved useful, he would be willing to surrender or cooperate. Then he melted into his dark feathers and disappeared. Naomasa had no time to question the request. He sighed, took out his phone, and prepared to call his friend, unsure how to explain everything but confident that his friend would agree if given the circumstances. The next day, Tashinori Yagi, the former symbol of peace and once the greatest hero and wielder of One for All, stood in the same alley where Izuku and Naomasa had met. Tashinori observed the surroundings and reflected that the young man hid and sometimes slept in dumpsters. The detective watched the scene and noted that Izuku had been living like that for the past 8 months. He looked paler and thinner than the last time anyone had direct contact. Tsukachi explained this as he stepped closer to the blonde former hero. Izuku's voice was heard suddenly. He said that, despite everything, he could still pursue his goals. The two men turned and saw the green-haired young man emerging from another alley, removing his hood and revealing his face. Tsukachi asked if Izuku had managed to bathe the previous day, noticing the cleaner face and different clothes. Izuku answered that he had also obtained new garments in order to look presentable. After all, he was going to speak again with the man known as the symbol of peace. Toshinori asked that they call him simply Toshinori now, since he no longer believed he deserved the old title, and wondered calmly but uncertainly whether they had met before. Izuku confirmed they had, about a year and a half earlier, and suggested the detective would know the exact date. Tsukachi realized with a sharp intake that it had been the day of Izuku's disappearance. Izuku agreed and explained that on that very day his hero, the figure he had clung to for years, had given him the last push by telling him he could not be a hero if he had a quirk that had only harmed others. He said it with seriousness while circling the blonde, then added that it no longer mattered. Toshinori admitted he did not remember the moment clearly and only had a brief glimpse of it, and began to speak further. Izuku interrupted firmly, telling him not to apologize. Over time he had understood he could not blame Toshinori, which was why he insisted it did not matter. Izuku said there was little that could be done for him personally now, but there was much to be done for the world, especially for children and teenagers who mimicked their heroes and needed to learn to stop placing so much importance on powers. He argued that the world should see those without powers, those with seemingly useless quirks, and those whose quirks made them different, as exactly the same as everyone else. Toshinori asked what Izuku specifically suggested. Izuku urged him to take action and questioned whether the celebrated symbol of peace would do nothing to improve the world just because he could no longer fight. Toshinori looked down, realizing his mistake and answering that, of course, he would not ignore the problem. Izuku said that was all he needed. He would not expect Toshinori to clean up every alley on his own. That was the task of others, and began to walk toward the corner of the alley. Tsukachi reminded Izuku that he had brought Toshinori here as requested and asked if Izuku would hold up his end of their agreement. Izuku dismissed the idea of surrendering immediately, saying it would be foolish since nothing guaranteed that the conversation would have any effect. He then melted into his feathered cloak and vanished. The two men stared at the spot where the green-haired young man had been. The blonde wore a look of regret and the detective looked annoyed, but both were startled by a voice behind them. A rat made of shadow had perched on a trash can and conveyed that it would continue its work. If it saw any initiative within 2 months, it would contact the detective and turn itself in without problems. The shadowy rat dissolved after delivering the message, and the former number 1 hero's expression brightened slightly. Tsukachi asked Toshinori what had happened, noting his smile. Toshinori replied that he felt ashamed for having denied Izuku his dream and for not remembering their conversation due to how rushed he had been. Perhaps that haste had prevented him from paying the attention it deserved. He added that seeing Izuku so cautious, reflective, and determined made him regret that he no longer wanted to be a hero. Tsukachi suggested that in a way Izuku was still acting like a hero, though not in the official sense. Wanting to be one would mean giving in to the very system he aimed to change. He placed a hand on his friend's shoulder and said Izuku had told him he wanted to be the kind of hero many people needed. The two men left, discussing the problem Izuku had raised. Toshinori began considering what he should do to help, and he wanted to speak with Izuku again. Even though Izuku had said there was nothing to be done for him personally and that he did not blame Toshinori for how he had ended up, Toshinori felt he owed an apology shown through actions and wanted to help Izuku live better. A couple of blocks away, Izuku dropped from a rooftop into the end of a dead-end alley. There, a group of girls were dumping the contents of another girl's backpack and mocking her. Izuku, seeing they were middle school students, thought that early maturity did not always mean better judgment. He stepped forward and questioned why they were harassing the girl instead of being at school working toward their futures. Summer, which had once been wonderful for most people, had become a kind of hell for Izuku. He had usually worn many layers during autumn, winter, and part of spring, but as the heat rose that habit became torture. He decided he no longer cared if anyone recognized him and began wearing less and not bothering so much to hide his face. That was why he was now tucked into a grove in a wealthier part of the city, where traffic was light and he could rest. He had been in Osaka for almost a month and planned to leave in a few days to return to Tokyo, where Naomesa's office was. He intended to find Naomasa and contact him to fulfill his part of their agreement, since the others had honored theirs. Izuku reflected that he would never have imagined the same man who had once destroyed his dream would be so relentless. He stared at a torn poster he had pulled from a wall. The man who had been the #1 hero about a year ago now acted as an ambassador of peace, campaigning, giving talks, appearing on television, and encouraging other heroes to do the same. All of that had happened in 2 months, because Toshinori Yagi had moved quickly the day after. He spoke with the principal of UA, Nizu, who contacted the directors of the other hero academies across the country, and from there launched a campaign with Toshinori as its leading figure. Izuku knew none of that guaranteed what had happened to him would not happen again, but it was a start. If years from now nothing changed, then there would be nothing left to do. He stretched and let himself fall onto the grass, watching the daytime sky with the leaf shadows sheltering him and shielding him from the sun, savoring what might be some of his last days of freedom. He felt strange. The past 10 months of earning a living and fighting had been some of the hardest in superficial ways, but they had been the first time in years he did not feel constantly tense or suffer nightmares about someone who had once been his mother. He concluded that people found calm in different things. Izuku admitted to himself that he was bored and planned to use the night to look for criminals before moving on to Tokyo. He had noticed subtle changes when he asked Toshinori whether things were different. A normal person might not notice, but Izuku had seen fewer middle school kids bullying others in alleys. High school troublemakers had not changed much, and true criminals would not vanish so easily. Even if supervillains diminished, thieves, SXL predators, and bullies who prowled alleys were harder to eliminate, so going to the city center likely meant encountering some of them. He closed his eyes to nap until night fell and intended to take advantage of that darkness to search the alleys of a quieter-looking city. 5 days later, Naomasa Tsukachi felt a great weight lift from his shoulders. He had finally managed to mark Izuku's case as closed, though he had been uneasy for a week after the 2-month mark, waiting for Izuku to fulfill his part of the deal. Those worries evaporated when he was called to collaborative work with other detectives, and now he was returning to his office because there were files there he thought would help and wanted to share. When Naomasa entered his office, he found dark, bird-like shapes everywhere and was startled until he realized they belonged to Izuku. He sighed deeply and, not sure what else to do, reached out to touch one. It vanished. Izuku then appeared behind him and chided him for being impatient. Naomasa turned and asked where Izuku had come from. Izuku brushed it off and indicated a ventilation crack as the route he had taken, then asked what he was supposed to do now. Naomasa concluded that Izuku would surrender without further resistance. Tsukachi exclaimed in surprise and told him to do this properly, asking him to wait in an alley next to the building and promising to arrive in 10 minutes. The protagonist simply nodded and dematerialized into his dark feathers to slip through the vents that led into the building's ventilation system. Tsukachi watched curiously as he vanished, then retrieved the documents he had come for and left quickly. Minutes later, Naomasa walked down the alley beside his building and stopped when he noticed a silhouette leaning on a pile of trash bags. Tsukachi explained that the procedure was straightforward. He would put on restraints that inhibited the quirk factor and take him to the police, where he would spend the night while his fate was decided. He then asked if Izuku was truly sure about surrendering. Izuku reminded him that a promise is a debt and that he had committed to turning himself in if All Might could do something. He added that all he had left was his freedom, and after nearly a year of living the way he had, that was enough. Tsukachi accepted that and fitted the restraints, saying they would go to the police station. The protagonist lowered his head and followed the detective, wearing a neutral expression as he reviewed everything that had happened since he began working as a vigilante. The next day, with fewer major villain incidents and less flashy hero news, journalists were hungry for anything interesting. Like other younger heroes, they had followed the trail to Izuku. Naomasa had suspected this, but he had not imagined that a leak in the early morning would fill the police station with reporters within hours. From his cell, Izuku asked if he was truly that important. Tsukachi replied that, without major villains or criminal organizations to cover, Izuku was the most interesting story they could get. Izuku expressed his disappointment that so much attention focused on a single vigilante when there were many other things that deserved investigation. Tsukachi pointed out that Izuku was no longer a simple vigilante. He might be the first in history with a continuous record spanning so many cities, a known identity, and a past as a villain. Izuku admitted he had never liked being the center of attention and that being famous for this only annoyed him. He said he should have received attention when he needed it, and the world had ignored him. The detective did not answer and only sighed. He suspected Izuku's remarks were not malicious but thought the green-haired young man probably needed counseling. The cell block door opened, and Nizu entered, walking cheerfully beside All Might. Nizu greeted Naomasa warmly. Naomasa asked in surprise what the director was doing there. Toshinori explained that Nizu had insisted on coming. Nizu said he had wanted to meet Crow in person, noting that Izuku's story and recent actions had caused a stir and had been discussed widely on various programs. Izuku acknowledged Nizu's information with a raised head and said it did not particularly interest him. He only expected to be taken to a prison cell and to rest, comforted by the knowledge that he had done everything he could. Toshinori admitted he was saddened to hear Izuku had already made that decision. Nizu began to say he had other plans, but Toshinori interrupted him with seriousness. The mouse-like director stopped, turned toward the blond man, and sighed after looking at him for a few seconds. Hours earlier, outside Yue, Nizu and Toshinori waited for the limousine that would take them to the Tokyo police station where Izuku had been captured. Toshinori told Nizu that it was not necessary for the director to go and that he was only going because he wanted to speak with the young man again. Nizu said he wanted to talk to him as well and smiled. Toshinori, speaking more earnestly, reminded Nizu that although he was his friend, he preferred the director not to go. He doubted that Nizu's intentions were purely pedagogical. Nizu replied that he would offer Izuku a place to continue his studies, to train, and to pursue the dream of becoming a hero. Toshinori quickly interrupted, insisting that Nizu would be forcing Izuku to live in the same place as someone who had tormented him for years and pushed him to his limits. In an environment representing much of what he rejected, he suspected Izuku might prefer prison. Toshinori said he respected Nizu, but he also thought Nizu sometimes used methods almost as radical as those of a villain, and forcing Izuku into that situation would be in that same vein. Nizu fell quiet for a minute until the limousine arrived. He proposed that both of them go, that Toshinori present whatever he wished, and that if Izuku refused, the director would take over from there. Back at the station, Toshinori approached the cell and acknowledged that Izuku had resigned himself to prison and that some illegal actions needed to be punished. He assured Izuku that he did not believe Izuku had committed anything truly evil and that he was not a bad person. Toshinori added that, although Izuku had explained how his resentment had faded as he came to understand the world better, Toshinori still felt guilty for his own past actions. Izuku asked Toshinori to get to the point and asked what he wanted to say. Toshinori interrupted sharply. He told him that he could not rebuild his life as if nothing had happened, but he did not deserve prison or to live confined in a place that made him uncomfortable. He extended a hand and offered to help, asking him to accept the proposal and promising to do everything necessary so he would receive what he truly deserved. Silence filled the room. Tsukachi looked at his friend, surprised by the words and the conviction behind them, while Nizu fixed his gaze on Izuku. Izuku looked directly into the blonde's eyes. The hero's sky-blue, crystalline eyes remained steady against those emerald eyes that had been dimmed by a dull tone. The sounds of car horns and engines, the glow of streetlights and billboards, the night wind that was what Izuku felt as he moved between the alleys using his dark feathers. Night had fallen. It was the hour when his activities were most productive, and he was searching for criminals or bullies who might be roaming the streets. He decided to climb a relatively tall building to observe the city and feel the summer night wind on his skin, taking his time to do so calmly. A loudspeaker announced that prisoner 3332's time to go to the yard had arrived. Izuku opened his eyes, cursed under his breath, and sat up. He found himself in a completely white room where he could only make out the padded floor, the pattern on the walls, and a speaker in one corner. There was a bed, a partially enclosed bathroom, and a ball, but beyond the walls he could see nothing. The room was sparse. The green-haired young man rose to his feet, rubbing his face and ruffling his curly hair. After no more than 10 seconds, the floor descended slowly into a similar chamber with a tunnel. He walked through the tunnel and arrived in seconds at an outdoor space about 15 meters in length and width, covered in grass with a single tree in the middle. Izuku let out a soft sound of pleasure and flopped onto the grass. He looked up at the sky, noting the glass above that, together with the collar-inhibiting quirks, prevented those brought to that place from escaping. He stayed there for several minutes, watching the sky tinged orange with large, dark clouds. Izuku thought that it was autumn now and that 6 months had passed since that incident, pressing an arm to his face as the memory surfaced. 6 months earlier, in the same white room that had felt almost empty, he had been playing with a ball he had received the day before, while he had spent the last few hours throwing it against a wall. The loudspeaker announced that prisoner 3332 had a visitor, which made him react. Izuku wondered whether it would be Tsukachi coming with a request or the rat coming to bother him again. The floor descended into a room with a large pane of glass that allowed him to see who was on the other side, which left him surprised. Izuku did not expect the ninth wielder of One for All to be his visitor that day, and he stared at the blonde with surprise. Melissa explained calmly that when they had first spoken directly she had said she wanted to talk to him. She admitted that a lot of time had passed since then, but she had hoped to be able to speak with him now. Izuku recalled the time he had fought Stain and remembered that he had once said he would give her some time to talk. Melissa acknowledged that it simply had not been possible until then, but even after almost 2 years there were still things she wanted to discuss. She sat in a chair in front of the glass and looked thoughtful. Izuku asked, bewildered, why she would want to speak with someone like him at that point. Melissa said that once it would have been to question how good a criminal could become or what his motivations were, but after his capture nearly a year earlier his whole story had become known. Still, she had insisted on being allowed to come, and here she was, uncertain of exactly what to say. Silence fell as they stared at each other until Izuku sighed and sat down in front of the glass. He told her that he would be no better at answering than anyone else, but if she wanted to talk he would ask one question: how did the power feel? Melissa admitted that at first it had felt strange, that it was obvious it did not belong to her. She demonstrated briefly as blue crackling energy flickered from her hand, and she said that when the quirks of previous wielders manifested it had felt even stranger, but over time she had made it her own. Izuku asked if she had been quirkless, noticing her scars and receiving a nod. He asked how her childhood had been. Melissa said she had wanted to be a hero, to save people and be as impressive as All Might, but she had been diagnosed as quirkless and felt that dream vanish. With her father's support, however, she realized how little having a quirk mattered and that one could be a hero in other ways. Izuku said it was good that her father had supported her, then asked somewhat awkwardly if his mother had been mentioned when people talked about his story. Melissa said no, she had only heard that his mother had died years ago, and asked why he was asking. Izuku dismissed it and the visit continued for about 20 minutes until the allotted time ended and Melissa left. Back in the present, Izuku reflected that Melissa had visited 3 times since then. Unlike Tsukachi, who came more often, Melissa spoke about life and the past, not about society, heroes, or villains, only personal anecdotes. She had become his first friend since the incident with his quirk that had changed everything, and that alone mattered. A loudspeaker announced that prisoner 3332 had a visit and that his time outside would be cut short. The announcement ordered him to return to his cell immediately. Izuku thought, annoyed, that it would either be the detective coming to bother him or Nizu arriving to try to get his help with something. He walked back toward the tunnel and entered the room that rose slowly into a chamber with a glass partition, where Detective Tsukachi stood on the other side. Detective Tsukachi greeted Izuku and noted that he looked as pale as when he had last visited. Izuku replied that the lack of sunlight did not help and, with a small gesture, asked whether the detective had come to chat, needed help with another case, or had been sent by All Might. Tsukachi suggested that it must be monotonous and boring to be shut away in that place, with no one to talk to except for the times S.H.I.E.L.D. visited and only getting outside once a week. Izuku said that was true. He added that his poor social skills only survived because of those visits and that his physical condition was deteriorating, but he tried to downplay it by saying he had probably been worse before. Tsukachi considered that and murmured that he probably had been worse, then stepped out of his thoughts and pulled out some papers. He informed Izuku that he had finally completed the sentence of 1 year, 4 months, and 1 day that had been handed down to him. A heavy silence fell over the room as Izuku stared at the man with disbelief, realizing that indeed more than a year had passed. A little over a year earlier, Izuku had thanked All Might for the offer but said he preferred to go through the judicial process. Toshinori looked disappointed and glanced indirectly at Nizu. Nizu, smiling, had expected that response and stepped forward to say that, since Izuku had rejected the offer, his fate was now the principal's responsibility. Izuku interrupted Nizu with a blunt declaration that he could not care less what Nizu intended to do with him and that he would serve whatever time the law required. Nizu asked more seriously if Izuku would not listen to any proposal at all. Izuku confirmed he would not. Nizu expressed regret and, with a stern tone, said he would come for Izuku the next day to make him anew. Before Nizu could finish, Izuku activated his quirk and called forth shadowy tendrils that wrapped around the principal, immobilizing him in a dramatic, stylized, anime-like display. The restraints held Nizu firmly, preventing any immediate protest. Detective Tsukachi rose to order Izuku to stop. Izuku complied, withdrawing the shadows and letting the principal fall back onto the floor. Nizu, breathing a little harder than before, admitted he had not expected that reaction and had not realized Izuku lacked a quirk inhibitor collar. Izuku said he had not planned to use one, placing the responsibility on Nizu rather than on himself, and urged Nizu to abandon such a foolish idea. Nizu recovered his composure and reminded Izuku that he was stubborn. Izuku replied that he would resist any attempt to force him into that plan and made the cell fill briefly with a show of shadowy energy as a warning. The place fell silent again. The movement of Izuku's shadows was the only sign of life. Nizu stared back without his usual smile, clearly displeased that Izuku's refusal had been so absolute and that any attempt to manipulate him had been thwarted. Toshinori tried to reason that, because of Izuku's redemptive actions, it was unlikely he would remain in prison for more than 2 years. Izuku shrugged and asked to be left alone, saying he had been awake for too long to think about the future and that life's best things often arrived by surprise. He ended the conversation by sitting quietly and declining to speak further. Days later, Izuku walked down a long, dim corridor toward a bright light ahead. Toshinori greeted him warmly as he emerged. Izuku admitted that he had not realized how much he would miss fresh air outside and lingered at the railing, looking out. He stood on the edge, extended his arms, and looked up at the sky with a small smile, reminding himself as he had once told All Might that it felt pointless to plan life too rigidly when the best things often came unexpectedly. He leaned against the railing, thinking that life had taught him those small moments were what made it truly good. The blonde watched him with a small smile, noticing how the green-haired's hair moved with the wind and how his quiet smile made him seem completely different from the image he had seen of him 3 years earlier in that tunnel, or less than a year and a half ago in that alley. The list of Izuku's past flashed through his mind. The first time his quirk had manifested, his mother's suicide and the letter she had left him, his own attempts to end his life, the time Kurogiri had kidnapped him and he had met All for One, the night his house was burned, his early training with Amber, the first time he went out to study specific heroes' quirks, the initial experiments he conducted, the attack on the USJ, the long hours analyzing quirks at the sports festival and the meeting with Stain that same night in a bar, the fight with Stain and his encounter with the students from UA, the camp attack that ended his relationship with the League, his work with Overhaul and the meeting with Eri that led to betrayal of a Yakuza to free her, his year as a vigilante, the meeting with Tsukachi and All Might that allowed him to make the change he wanted, and finally his time in prison where he became friends with Melissa. All of those highs and lows had been Izuku's journey, filling him with experience from many different circumstances. None of it, however, would be of use in his new mission. A man with torn clothing and cat-like ears raised his voice inside the workshop and ordered Izuku to make sure all the crystals were properly edged within the next hour. Izuku obediently acknowledged the instruction and returned to his task. The protagonist stood with his hair trimmed short, using his shadow-covered limbs to hold a string of crystals while a machine cut each one into a perfect circular shape. He counted silently as he worked, thinking they were almost 20 more, setting those aside and taking new pieces to repeat the process. This was one of several jobs he performed at the Crystal Refinery, a place that also provided construction services when buildings were damaged during hero and villain conflicts. The site was almost always busy, and employees received extra pay for debris collection and reconstruction. He spent the hour cutting circular crystals that would later be used in furniture or buildings. A coworker named Taka approached and pointed toward the storage area, indicating that Izuku should stack the finished crystals there since they were almost done for the day. Izuku thanked him and, when he saw the afternoon light, manifested his book. The page he opened glowed, and shadows covered his arms, making them large enough to carry all the finished crystals to the storage area Taka had pointed out. As he stepped away from the storage, Izuku noticed signs of spring. Small flowers dotted nearby patches of ground. He breathed in the air and decided it was time to go home. He changed in a small office, grabbed a coat and a backpack, and headed for a metal door about 30 meters away. A man at the doorway waved and said goodbye. Another reminded him not to be late the next day. Izuku waved in return, stepped out into the street that led to the industrial neighborhood where he worked, and chose a route through the alleys instead of the main roads. He put his hood up and started what he called his evening cleanup. On the way home, he moved through the alleys confronting several rough gang members. He subdued them with quick, controlled maneuvers, treating the encounters like the patrols he carried out as a vigilante. The detentions were efficient and did not become brutal. The detours added nearly an hour to his journey, but he preferred it that way. When he finally opened the door to his small apartment on the top floor of a 6-story building, he dropped his things onto the couch and sighed at the thought that there had been more gangs out than usual that day, mostly young troublemakers following some new fad. A knock announced Melissa's arrival. She entered and asked if he had just gotten home. Izuku looked up and explained that he had taken longer than usual because of the evening cleanup. Melissa sat across from him and described how Endeavor's influence covered too much ground and moved too quickly, so she could barely pause without losing advantage, but she hoped that if she could surpass him in his own city she would only have to maintain that pace. Izuku told her that it was not necessary to be number one to become the hero she wanted to be. Izuku murmured thoughtfully. Melissa responded with a smile that she supposed he was right, but if she had moved to another city he would have been alone. Izuku admitted that it was not something extraordinary, but that it still mattered. They both smiled slightly. Their friendship, born from her visits to him in prison, had grown until Melissa had taken him in when he had nowhere else to go. She had offered him the apartment All Might had helped him get in his 3rd year at the academy, which had ended about a month earlier. Now a licensed professional hero, Melissa had decided to stay in Tokyo to build her reputation near Endeavor's agency, and making that work had not been easy. After that, Melissa went to change while Izuku stood to prepare dinner, his usual task in the house. Melissa asked when his next appointment with the psychologist was. Izuku checked a calendar and said it was in 2 days, and that the minimum appointments Tsukachi had told him to attend were over, so he expected this would be the last one. Melissa suggested it would not hurt to keep seeing a therapist from time to time, that it was always good to have someone to talk to. Izuku considered the idea. They ate the dinner Izuku made and talked about how their days had gone before going to sleep a few hours later. Days later, Izuku asked, bewildered, under what reasoning it was a good idea to leave Eri with him. Toshinori explained that even after 2.5 years she still remembered him well, and that ever since she had learned Izuku was living with Melissa she had wanted to come see him. Izuku agreed that he, too, would like to see how she was, but insisted that leaving her in his sole care for a week was unreasonable. Melissa, showing a photo of the girl, assured him that Eri was a sweetheart and a treasure, and that it would not be a problem for a couple of days. Izuku noted how much Eri had grown and asked if there were no other options. The person nicknamed Mouse, Tsukachi, anyone else more comfortable with children. It turned out the circumstances had aligned so that Izuku was the best option. Everyone else was unavailable, and one way or another, he was chosen. Toshinori added that if Aizawa had authorized Izuku to be the caregiver it was because there truly was no better choice. Izuku muttered that he would have believed it if Melissa were staying, but he had no confidence in himself and refused, crossing his arms. 3 days later, Izuku complained again as he laid Eri in bed and tucked her in, wondering why things had ended up like this. Aizawa handed him a bag with clothes and brief instructions to make sure Eri ate on schedule, slept well, had at least 4 meals a day, that the meals be varied, and that she bathed at least once. Those were the only words Aizawa left before departing without giving Izuku time to ask more. Melissa, seeing him complain, whispered that he could not deny the warmth he felt seeing Eri asleep like that. Izuku grumbled that small children simply did not appeal to him and then asked if Melissa was leaving. Melissa explained that All Might should be on his way to the airport and that they would be arriving at Island the next morning. They agreed to see each other the following week. They hugged, and Melissa left with a bag, leaving Izuku in the silence of the apartment. Izuku turned off the lights, leaving everything in darkness, and went to his room. He watched Eri sleeping peacefully in her bed, moved a chair beside the window, and sat down. He reflected on the years that had passed and all he had experienced, thinking that even he would not have believed 3 years earlier that he would end up here. His life had become relatively normal, with its efforts and difficulties, its frustrations and rewards, steady work, and healthy relationships. He whispered that he might not deserve something so good, but that it was what he had. Slowly he began to fall asleep, glancing once more at Eri to make sure she was all right before finally drifting into a deep rest. That night he slept soundly. At that moment Izuku was captivated by the girl, mostly by her quirk, analyzing it again while running through the data he had collected earlier. He was somewhat oblivious to his surroundings and missed the exchange of words between Tenya and Melissa. He was also unaware that someone was about to strike at his neck. Stain whispered that it was over and swung his sword toward Izuku's neck in a clean, precise motion. Native and the 2 students watched in disbelief as the assassin brought his blade down. They only saw the instant the strike reached Izuku's throat. Izuku admitted that they had caught him, but he pointed out that they had forgotten something important. He also had a quirk. He turned to show his neck intact but cloaked in shadow, then his legs began to transform into black feathers. He explained that it had not been necessary to use it before because he trusted his strategy, and now his task was finished. Those students were Stain's rivals. Stain cursed in anger as part of his sword detached. He demanded why Izuku had not used his ability sooner. Melissa called out to Izuku and asked if he was one of the 3 central villains of the USJ, saying she wanted to talk to him. Tenya and Native were surprised by her question, while Stain remained uninterested. Izuku appeared slightly unsettled by the interruption. Izuku told Melissa that if she survived her fight with Stain, he would find some time to speak with her. He gave a small smile and then vanished. He reappeared on the roof of a building a few streets away. He reassured himself that none of them would die and noted that he had seen Todoroki approaching the scene, so they should be all right. He wondered what the girl wanted as he walked along the rooftop. He stopped to look at the stars for a moment. It had been a long time since he had done so, and he remained there for a few minutes, lost in thought and appreciating the calm of the night sky.